Hey, I've been good. Tired and stretched thin, but working and yeah, I've been taking a break from thinking. Uh, but also in a way to see if the thoughts that I had thunk survive. You know what I mean? Are they
Yep, yep.
important? Do they remain salient despite the passing of time? It's like when I write a song or something and I get excited about it, I tend to just let it sit there for 6 months and then see if it's still any good. Um, yeah, but that's what I've been thinking about thinking. Yeah, but
Well, I
I've
like
been
that.
missing you guys and missing coming to this, and yeah, it's nice to be hanging.
Well, it's good to have you, sir, and we miss you. And no, that's funny because, yeah, I experience personally, like, I'm hoping to get back to a novel we wrote after getting Belonging Again 2, which is trying to kill me. And I've been thinking a lot of your work because a part of that is this thing called the work of limits. And I've been thinking about that with social coordination. So I appreciate the work that you've done on that topic. And I was bringing up a lot of the stuff that came up in our conversations. But a lot of times with like the novel Turn the World from 2016 or the literature or the short stories, I actually think it's really important to actually kind of set it, walk away. I kind of experience going from the stories to the philosophy or then kind of working at Mead Lake as almost this period of letting things sit. And I think that's really, really important because I also think about stories like Under the Wing or Heroes that I'm like, really glad I didn't release that when I thought it was good because actually it wasn't, but you thought it was. And actually, how letting it sit allows you to come back and almost finally see it because you do get to this place where it's hard to see the thing in front of you. I also do question thoughts that you have to hold on to for them to stick. Like if there's a thought that like if you let go, it doesn't come back to you. Like then there's reason to believe that it may not be part of the world, just part of your own conception of the world or what you want it to be the case that it lacks something. And so I think there's something to be said. There is something about a thought that won't leave you alone or a story that won't leave you alone that suggests there's a substance there, that there's actually something there. But if you don't give it that space, you never test it. And then you're just kind of worried. Like there is also something about not trusting the idea where you're worried that if you set it down or you stop working on it, you'll lose it and it will go away. It does actually seem really important to create that space. I'd be curious if you have any thoughts to that, Alex, and I'll throw it to Daniel here.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I've been on both sides of it. There's a hilarious little video of David Lynch saying something like, "If you have an idea and you forget it, you want to kill yourself." And he's telling everyone to write everything down as soon as you can, because the moment you forget that great idea, you feel like you've missed your path in life. It becomes an existential failure. At the same time, I was just my wife just got me this just plebeian sort of one of those books on philosophy, like the history of philosophy, and each there's like 2 pages dedicated to each philosopher in history, so it's sort of really cursory and silly. But I'm reading it before I go to bed, and and it's like, well, philosophy first developed Western philosophy in Ionia, in Medea before, and the reason that most people attribute it to is because they all had time to kill. There was a sort of a wealth that allowed for a sort of upper middle class to go workless and sort of have a passive income. And what else are you going to do but start thinking about shit that doesn't matter, which is basically philosophy. Like doesn't immediately matter. Do you know what I mean? And so, in my life right now, been going through. I'm taking care of my father. My studio burnt down. My dad's house flooded. Um, my dad's on his last legs. you name it. And so this respite from philosophical thought is perhaps not as intentional as it is incidental to real life, requiring my actual, attention. And then these frankly ideas that don't literally matter, these abstracted thoughts, naturally taking a back seat because I'm no longer in the Ionian, luxury of leisure. So yeah, leisurely time, right? So, um, so it is interesting just in the sense of like, well, what does rise to the top despite the lack of leisure? Because when I have leisurely time, I mean, they can everything's salient if I want it to be. It's I can make the most, I can make minutia the mountain. Um, but when life takes over and things get, real, it is interesting to see what of those abstractions persists as a relevant, topic. I'm right. I'm finishing a novel myself. Is it? Do I find myself gravitating to that? Do I find myself gravitating toward, finishing, freak theory, uh, tome, dedicated to metaphysics? Do I find myself just frantically trying to finish songs so that I can make a bit more money? Um, and it is interesting to see what's rising to the top, but specifically in the context of philosophy, um, I am finding that, for instance, conversations about, different organizations of temporal category are less interesting to me right now. Um, the idea of philosophy or metaphysics as pure art without any sort of utilitarian valence, is feels trite at the moment. Um, and then there's the other issue, and then I'll shut up, which is that a lot of the freak theoretical work that I've been doing metaphysically over the last 5 years basically finds its apotheosis in a pet theory about, um, the emergence of consciousness, which finds its most relevant, implementation in machine consciousness, in terms of like it finds its most relevant proof in machine consciousness, whether or not it's accurate would, and is that something, is that good? Like, should I even put out, like, let's say I'm right, should I put that out? Would that be good? Seems like it would be bad, maybe, um, to give anyone a leg up on developing machine consciousness. So, it's sort of like, where is the point of obsolescence, or the point of diminishing returns with regard to theoretical development? It's like the back doors on one of those cars where you just want to open the fucking trunk, but now you have to click the thing and wait for 10 seconds while it slowly opens and beeps. It's just like we've gone too far. We've made too much progress. Um, so yeah. Anyway, that's what I've been thinking.
Well, first, you're going through a lot, and thank you for sharing all that. And yeah, that makes me, if I just reflect on myself, not that it's any sort of universal guideline, I guess on my own life, and then I'll give it to Daniel and Mr. DeClerc here, and Mr. Luber. Good to see you. And DeClerc, congrats on the poetry collection, sir. That's fantastic. And yeah, personally, I always came to almost appreciate working at the wholesale, unloading trucks, because there was something one about it that seemed to kind of naturally lead to almost a focusing on philosophy or thought or stories that felt like it had something to do with unloading trucks. or the or the exchanges you would have with coworkers or people, because if it didn't, there was kind of a feeling of something being off. And I think it is important, like all the hours you like weed eating or doing things around here, to actually see them as a necessary part of the quote unquote work. And then, of course, the question becomes, what is the work? And there is a kind of funny dimension where the work for me is larger than just the writing. There's something about the writing in these conversations and everything that is the work, but it's also, I think, something to do with living. Ivan Illich would talk about the art of living. And I'm just convinced that there's something about thinking and art and all of that that is necessary for the art of living. But there's always this problem of me deciding what part of it is best. That might just be egoic or my own assumptions that actually doesn't pass a test of life. Like it actually, if you submit it to the pressures of money or taking care of family or children or all of that, it actually would fall away, which actually would suggest that perhaps we have not seen the fullness of philosophy yet, because many of the philosophers weren't married or they weren't thrown into tensions. And actually, yeah, there's something about leisure that helps you think, but there's also perhaps something to be said about the ideas that uniquely emerge in pressure systems that actually are needed. And I think sometimes perhaps I guess for me personally, it's just important not to think of the challenges of life that come up as in the way of philosophy. Oh, it's in the way of thinking. Oh, it's in the way of art. No, it actually is by some sort of pressure system, part of it, actually helping you kind of sort, helping you kind of figure out what to prioritize that otherwise you might not be able to do. And there are also some ideas that are better not to do. There are also some things that are better to let fall away. But how can you tell? By what standard? Well, what life throws at you can be a pretty good one. And I think also for me, like a reason why Michelle and I were just talking about this actually. One of the reasons why I also have just found it really important to regularly talk with Michelle about the ideas or the work, or like to make it a work that we share, is because there's also something about, if the ideas that you have are not somehow coming to bear on your relationship, your marriage, or helping you like not constantly have an angry voice in your head, or actually not helping you figure out how to share in beauty with the other person, then there's a kind of test it fails. There's a kind of there's something perhaps wrong. Now that doesn't mean the ideas are bad, because there's plenty of ideas you have that don't necessarily bear on the marriage or something like that. But there is also something to say, if you never think ideas that actually help you think through maybe misunderstandings, like a misunderstanding Michelle and I just talked about, was the difference between probable and possible, and actually how that actually helps us think about misunderstandings we can have. Like, for example, we were having a conversation if we should go down to the creek and take the children. And Michelle was saying, is an idea, should we do it in the middle of the day or in the evening? And for me, if you do it, like part of the conversation is the idea, well, we ought to wait for the evening because it's not going to be so hot. Well, that can be heard as saying that you don't want to go down to the creek, actually, that you don't want to do it at all. When really it's more because there's an idea, it's of course possible that going into the creek at the middle of the day would be fine, but is it probable, given the heat, given that the kids need to take a nap, et cetera, so forth, right? But often conversations about the probable can be interpreted, if you don't talk about it, as actually a suggestion of not wanting to do it all, right? And why do I bring up this example? Because actually, if you understand in a marital dynamic, the difference between one person talking from the probable, not against the possible, but emphasizing the probable, then actually you won't necessarily take what a person is saying as shutting down an idea, but actually figuring out how to bring the idea out, right? And if that's understood as the intentions of the people there, then that can avoid misunderstanding and hurt and stuff like that, right? And we had a whole conversation on that, like an OG, but that's just an example of where I have found that the ideas of which help you in those kind of circumstances are also the ideas that I find are not taken away by life's pressure. When you have to go to the venue of work, or when you have to unload boxes at a wholesale or something like that, or weed eat, the ideas that seem to not be ones that melt away or just kind of see empty are the ones that actually help you better engage or understand the people you care about. And that actually also makes you come to terms with the kind of person you actually are. That actually can also help you improve. So no, I think there's something to be said about the whole challenge of life and everything that life throws at one is actually being needed for testing the ideas and testing the work. And without that, I think there can be a tendency to not be able to tell what work is ultimately missing out on something and which ones are not. And look, it's not self-evident which are from the beginning. So actually having those tested life can kind of be important, or at least that's something that I have found in my own experience. But I will pause and give it to Daniel and then Mr. DeClerc and anyone else who wants to speak on this fine diet. Daniel, please.
It's good to see you and everyone. The for whatever reason, the way that you said, or even just the image of life throwing stuff at you, just really tickling me for some image of life throwing stuff. Just something in the quality stuck out. I'm not sure. It's just that I was just thinking in the beginning. You and Alex were speaking, Daniel. This I was struck a few weeks ago at, I get like an assumption, or thinking about knowledge primarily as through like an eating metaphor. Like I'm eating something, or that's primarily how thought or thinking is happening. And it struck me because that was even I've entertained that thought, but I guess I hadn't so much metabolized it. But then I there was like a shift in realizing how differently I might be oriented if I were relating to thinking predominantly in a via like an eating, because there's also there's the whole like metabolic process, you know. So there it also puts it kind of into the service of a coming to be, and then I'm kind of repeating the point in terms of what sticks, or like what is that knowledge by which I've become, or that thinking that it's I can definitely relate to a more, I don't know if it would be an anal or like neurotic need to just like record everything. I was very anxious to like get stuff done, or that I would miss it. Or so then I think I heard it from you, Daniel. The if you think about that, you can read a book and completely forget it, but you still you're a different person to the one that to yourself as having not read the book. Is I'm kind of laboring that, trying to say that, but the idea that is there, that there's some, so then that just goes into the theme of like what is thinking. And just the contribution I'm wanting to make is, and to share, was this eating metaphor, and I suppose I also taken the opportunity to like remind myself toward it. But in the background, there's something. There's okay. There's yeah. I'm stumbling to an end there. I was thinking of another. Like what? And that's a good like 40 seconds of and ah. So a lot of love to you all. I've been at the Philosophy Portal Palooza for the last couple of days. They're just completed now. But it's a, yeah, I mean it's a time commitment. You can also just kind of be on while you doing the daily necessaries. but aspects of life get neglected because of it, relationships, and because you're committing time to this thing. And then, but then I was also really struck or convicted by, specifically around kind of Marxist stuff, or just capital, in the sense of I need to try and understand this better. I need to make an effort if it structures my life so much. Um, but the conviction is more realizing how much I have defended myself almost from making that effort. And there's a bunch of inheritance, social aversion, cultural aversion, like the evil dark communists and stuff, and the Roy Gevaar in South Africa, like the etc. Um, I guess I'm sitting in the realization of that inheritance as well, but mostly I wanted to just contribute that little piece about eating.
Well, thank you for coming, and I hope everything is going well. That's wonderful that that's been going on. And no, I think eating has always been, that metaphor comes up from Michelle and I all the time. And I think, yeah, there's something to be said about thinking capital and all of that. And yeah, what's interesting with ideas or is it's hard to know what ideas are good to eat ahead of time, right? And what ones will you digest in a good way? And because every idea you have, I look at some projects I have on my computer as like that idea was really good, and it wasn't. And how you kind of over the years you develop a certain system. It's almost like with ideas, you need to let the food sit for a little bit before you eat into it to see if it actually can stand the test of time or something. Or I guess it would be the reverse with fresh food, like McDonald's. If you leave a cheeseburger out, it'll be good a year later. But a tomato, I can tell you from all these tomatoes we have, if you like, it just takes like 3 days and they go bad, right? So and Haven has made some of the best homemade pizza. Oh my gosh. If he's hearing me now, Haven, good job. It was really good. But there's something about, yes, thinking about ideas as something you digest, that you eat, that you take into you, but it's also just very interesting. And I guess Zizek would want to emphasize the excrement, perhaps. There's something to be said about thinking of that way, but then also questioning your ability to actually be able to tell what ideas are the ones you should eat versus not, right? Like actually setting up
So
certain
Daniel,
tests. Yes.
I'm really sorry to interrupt you, but I wanted your feedback or advice, or like, because in terms of social coordination mechanism, like um how much, because I feel like my thinking is very dialogical almost, and there's kind of a reliance on the other in that but then it can be very messy, like so then more like waiting on, I get producing something, letting it sit, and then sharing it. Like this is there's a big tension I feel with our affordance, Um, so I know you're not going to give me like a exact solution, but I guess I'm coming into contact in the last little bit with almost my my dialogical assumption, or the prioritization of that in my thinking effort. That's not excluding like a private uh isolated efforts, but it's something like the prioritization. I'm feeling like a distancing uh from it, and maybe that will help me be less uh, messy. But I'm sorry to interrupt you, but it was I had wanted that precise point, that particular wrestle to bring it forward.
Well, I mean, that is a massive question that I think is a really, really good one. And the way I hear that question that you're asking, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is there is a real tension between putting yourself under, say, a teacher or someone to learn from, and then doing your own work. Because there's something very problematic about saying I don't need to put myself under anyone to train, but then there's also something very problematic to getting stuck under there. And well, to start with that, and I'll give it to Mr. de Klerk and Mr. Luber. I guess in my creative life, I really, and I know we emphasize it a lot, And I always like Alex's idea that the meaning of life is courage. I have tried in those tensions to follow courage, like when I actually, or to actually face something, like for example, like let's take Hegel. There was a period of my time where I hated Hegel. I thought he was an idiot. I didn't want anything to do with him because I was coming out of the counter enlightenment, the Scottish Enlightenment. And then when you encounter people like Cadell or others, or these people, Holgate, who are working on Hegel, like, hey, there's really something there. Everything within me didn't want to put myself under Hegel. Everything in me didn't want to do it. So I was like, well, that means I need to, right? Like likewise, when there was a period of kind of going, oh, everything I write sucks. Because I can think about that, like with short stories or whatever. It was like, man, everything you write sucks. It doesn't land the way you want to. It's no good. I need to just kind of accept. That's actually when you needed to focus on your creativity. Actually, that's when you need to focus on your more and actually like give your stories to other people, right? I have found basically putting myself under the people that I don't want to put myself under to learn about has been very helpful, because that naturally creates a distance where you don't over identify. And then I have also found with creativity basically to lean in with, if I'm thinking the creative, and this is just for me, I'm not, there's a way more to be said. I have found leaning into that precisely when you're hopeless, or precisely going back and kind of going to fundamental levels of reading, like how to write a short story precisely when you think it's finished and done, and actually to put it through a fundamental test again. Like that has actually been very powerful to me. But there's a lot more to be said to that. But I'm going to pause and give it to Mr. DeClerc and then Mr. Luber. Mr. DeClerc, please.
Yeah, it's great to be here. And it's everything that's been brought up, starting with Alex around life getting in the way of philosophy, or like philosophy being like with the food metaphor. I was thinking of it in terms of like, to really stress test if the food you ate was good, try doing a workout a few hours after and seeing if you actually have energy, or seeing like, a few hours after you eat something, has this like really been metabolized and it's like been converted to like sustainable energy, or is there going to be like a crash in an hour or two, like to really like embody the information that you've digested, right, like into the world. And at least for me, in my experience, like different ideas work relatively better or worse with different people and in different settings, and like timing has to be right. Like, like I've definitely before gotten insights from the net or from something else, or like learned to practice, and then immediately been like, all right, let me try to like apply it here in my life where there's like a relationship that isn't like working, or there's like a sticky point. And then if the timing's not right, it can actually kind of just make things worse, because someone feels like they're being talked to or they're being patronized, and you're like, oh crap, like that's not what I wanted to do. But now they're like kind of on them now, so there's a skillfulness, I think, in taking ideas and figuring out how to like something that's helped me. And actually this has been advice that I've gotten in my poetry as well, is instead of being kind of declarative, because sometimes I'll do that in my poetry where like I'll have an insight, or I'll want to end a poem in a very like clear way so that people like don't have, they don't approach my poetry like it's some riddle that, is impossible to solve. But then people have given me the feedback of like, I think you were too declarative there. Like you gave the answer too clearly. And so their suggestion has been to frame things in a question. And just that simple move, it's like the answer can still be found in that question. But just by framing it as a question, you give the reader more openness and opportunity to, and it's an opening too. Like Daniel, you talk about that as well. It's like, it's an opening as opposed to like an internally consistent system. Like art can definitely become that if it becomes too dogmatic or something. And I think just the same way, like great ideas, if wielded in a way where you're trying to have someone see what you see, or have them see what you think that they can't see, or something like that. um yeah, you can really like shoot yourself in the foot with it. So I think that's the fun thing about philosophy, is like it's it's not it's not the like the goal is not to get to some clear and conclusive maxim that can just be applied in a one size fits all fashion. Like you take an idea, and that, like, I don't know, it's almost like a key to a door that, like, on the other side of is just like more hallways, as opposed to like the room that you have been wanting to get to like your whole life. And like, yeah, and then on the point of kind of life making certain philosophical conversations or certain philosophical ideas feel kind of trite or less meaningless. That's definitely something that I've experienced, as like I've touched grass, so to speak, or you get into a relationship and you're like, I don't have, or you start working, it's like I don't have time to, I used to be able to be on the net for 3 hours like every week, and it's like I can't do that anymore. um and there was like a little bit of like a grief about that, or like a worry of like, well, am I filling my day with things that are taking me away from like the real life, which is like this? That was like how I was conceptualizing in my head. And am I just gonna, am I going to be enslaved to whatever capitalism or relationships or things that like keep me from being able to think freely? Um, and there've been times where it's like, okay, yeah, actually I was in a bad job environment and it was like really killing me and, making me depressed or whatever. But for the most part, it's like I do like thinking about it with that food metaphor. It's like it's taking the food and then taking it out into the world. And what I've found is I don't always have to continue talking about the ideas for them to metabolize. Like I don't have to like go into the winery job that I'm working at and like talk about philosophy necessarily. I can just embody them in a specific way, and take an idea about um like James Baldwin talks about, how eating bread, like eating good bread and like really tasting it, is like as important as, all of these grand civil rights ideas that he was working on. And so like just, if I like make a meal for myself, just really taking the time to like digest it and enjoy it, and like that's that's philosophy as well. And I think, Daniel, you've been like a really big help for me in seeing that with like the return of the common life stuff and kind of that whole idea. um and yeah, the last thing before I pass it back, I think it's also helped me feel more connected to people that I otherwise would have written off as, oh, they're non-philosophical, they don't read these books, they don't, maybe they don't have interest in having these types of conversations. But actually, if I think about philosophy as like the deep engagement with the world, I look around me and I see more often than not, like most people have an affinity for that. And especially women as well. Like they're, in my experience, on the whole, less likely to want to talk about metaphysics for 3 hours. But like my girlfriend, like, smells every flower on a hike that we go on, and like cooks and eats in a way that is just like very inspiring to me. And you know, but she wouldn't probably have a conversation like this. But like that doesn't mean that we can't share a philosophical way of being with each other. And yeah, like, because I think there is a tendency for people who think deeply to feel very alone in the world a lot of times, and that be like a common experience. And that's not to say that like I don't still feel that like a lot of the time. But there's a way in which when you kind of view these types of conversations as like this is like the gymnasium for philosophy, that it does start to really open like a lot of possibilities and growth opportunities that maybe wouldn't have been afforded before. But yeah, I'll pass it back.
Funny. No, magnificent. I'll give it to Mr. Luber here. No, I think there's something just very interesting. Like if I think of myself, there's a certain way in which what almost seems best to do is there's a way where you're doing ideas and creativity where it's almost in a sense you just want to make it like everything else, where you talk about creativity and art just as naturally as you talk about cooking. But one of the issues is because basically everyone, even and maybe especially philosophers, think having a philosophical conversation is different. It is not part of common life. Then it gets almost an elevated status or an under, like a de-evolution, right? And part of the issue is actually making it equal. I would like basically conversations about novels or creativity or ideas to just be a base, like to be as much of a baseline as talk about football, right? To make it part of people's common life, where it neither has a special status or a downgrade. I was really struggling for that word, right? And there's something about, for me, like regularly having net conversations or conversation with Michelle. One of the reasons for me you do that is because actually the high majority of the time, you're not necessarily doing that, right? You're doing Mead Lake or doing different work. So if you don't actually create spaces to do it, you don't average. There's a certain sense in which the baseline does not include philosophical and artistic discussion, right? And you have to make a point to go to the gymnasium. And there's also a sense for me in which if philosophy and creativity is not just as common as everything else in common life, then the likelihood, to what Mr. Ebert was saying at the beginning, then the likelihood of being able to tell the ideas that are actually, quote unquote, the ones that you should think and the ones you shouldn't is much harder. Either because you overhold to them because they're elevated, or because you let them go because you downgrade it, right? And furthermore, the ideas that quote unquote stick because you're not as likely to just share them with your average people in your experience because you don't have a daily culture of art and creativity. You don't have natural testing. And you don't have that fun process of talking through ideas with people, right? Like there's a certain sense in which I want to imagine a world where talking about philosophy and art and the kind of stuff we do here is neither better nor worse than any other conversation topic. And I'm simply of the opinion that there's very few people, even philosophy and art people, for whom it is in a real sense equal, right? Like for a lot of people, it's downgraded. And for people who do it, it's upgraded, right? It's actually really hard to bring it to the same level, right? To actually experience it. And I don't know if I think that becomes really important. I think a way to think of it, like Ebert was saying that ideas are useless, like these philosophical ideas are useless. And it makes me think of Julia Benda, talking about that, like he was saying that higher education had committed a certain treason because now it was only teaching useful ideas, not useless ideas. Basically, only ideas that would get you a job. And he said this was a kind of tyranny of the intellectual because the useless ideas are the very horizon by which you define use. And so you actually need useless ideas because those are your eyes. That's how you see the world. And that kind of frames how you determine use in different things, right? Like I think about philosophical ideas and I think about, things that happened in life that had I not had useless ideas, then I would have seen them in a certain way that would have definitely created conflict or destroyed energy or trouble, right? But actually by having the ideas, you experience things that happen in a different way that changes what then follows, right? Which again is thanks to a different horizon of experience, like a different way that things occur, right? And if you don't have that horizon, then you're not going to you can't see the eyes you don't have, right? And you lose that. And so there's something about then kind of bringing ideas into the common life and yeah, there's of course, and you bring the ideas into the texture that then makes the common life have more dimensionality, more texture, that I then think actually there's a better way to experience a lot of this kind of work as being a horizon according to which you see things. There's more to be said on that, but I'm going to stop, give it to Mr. Luber, Daniel, and then Greg. Mr. Luber, please.
Great to be here. Yeah, I think so. Like, I have a rub with the relationship between metaphysics and valence, or as you put it, Ebert, like the valence, like any kind of utilitarian valence that's applied to metaphysics. Like, I don't buy that distinction. Or it's not that I don't buy it, it's just I'm very suspicious of it. Because like all these concrete examples about like of everyone's life and you know the different aspects of life. I like my philosophy is so intertwined with what I do during my day. So from my perspective, like, you know, I'm writing stories, and my philosophy is basically about writing stories, is about stories, is life a story, that kind of thing. Written a book with Alex that's not published and it's just sitting there more or less, right? And it's like, oh well, you know, is that above or below? Is it this? Is it that? Is it my priority? Is it not my priority? Well, what actually I think makes me do X work versus Y work is friendship, actually. I think what's overlooked in leisure time is the relationship between leisure. I don't you do what you do because you know one's relevant at the moment and one's not relevant. What actually creates that relevancy is the other person, I think. So like you know the second you think something is useful or not useful, it's already I think you know kind of fucked at that point. Like I think of a thought or a distinction that's being made, but rather somebody tangible in your life that actually does something to you or affects you that actually makes you act on X instead of Y. So like I've been working on this movie, The Hunt, for a while now, but before The Hunt, I wrote a book and Daniel was helping me write it every week for a whole year. And the reason why it went from the book to this movie is because my friend Tyler, who has a really great job, and the only way for him to move up is by directing something. So he comes to me and Alex and he's like, you guys are the best storytellers I know. Can you help me make a story? And my friendship with him and love for him, it's like, yeah, let's do it. And then that kind of just like consumed me. And ironically, it was the lack of thoughts of the lack of a distinction that actually made me change my trajectory in my action. Like it had nothing to do with me trying to like think about what, oh, you know, do I do this? Do I do that? It's a little different when you have like, you know, you were like, you know, there's pregnancy, there's old age, there's damage in a house. Like when there's like these real life issues coming in, to me, how I map that onto what I'm saying is those are the, you know, the other, those are the things that make you go like, oh, well, like, I want to focus on my wife, but my fucking studio just burned down. So I'm now gonna have to focus on that. Like there's, it forces you. Like I rarely think a distinction. My point is that a distinction in thought doesn't force you to do something. It's something in reality, a particularity in reality that actually forces you to move from X direction to Y direction. So like I, eh, with that being said, everything that I do philosophically affects my existential life. Like as like Daniel, like everybody's an existentialist, right? But where they lack is really being able to like really think about the ontological differences between focuses. You know, the difference between um you know, belonging and friendship. You know, there are differences. You know, belonging, you know, that's higher up on the scale. Like friendship could just be me and you, but belonging, that could apply to a whole group of people. You know, it apply to a million people belonging. So like being able to make those distinctions when you're thinking about like an inquiry, I think is very helpful, and it might help you move in that type of like inquiry that you're already doing. But like, what actually made you do the inquiry in the first place? Like, and like, Ebert, like, correct me if I'm wrong. I remember, like, in Freak Theory, it's like you were saying years ago. It's like, well, I'm making music all the time, and I'm looking at wave functions, and boom, like Freak Theory kind of came out of that behavior. And it's like, okay, if we keep going down the river, what made you even do music in the first place? Like before there was even fucking Freak Theory or making money making music, right? I bet there was some like real reality, something other that made you choose to do music versus writing a novel. Like you're writing a novel now, it's like, why didn't you write a novel 20, 30 years ago instead of music? Not, maybe you did and I don't know, but that's besides the point. The point is like, it's like, why this art versus another art? Why'd you do music? Like, why did I do storytelling? Well, maybe it's because I have no rhythm for music. I don't know, but I'm just making a joke. But I really think thought, and this is where like I have a hard time understanding the different, like how there is metaphysics as such that isn't deeply already intertwined with some utilitarian valence, because what makes you even enter metaphysics in the first place is some kind of particularity that serves as a utility in the sense of it's a force function for behavior, whatever. So like it's like you have a certain force function that forces you to have a certain behavior. That behavior is thinking about metaphysics, right? Talking to people about metaphysics, or listening to YouTube about metaphysics, or reading a book about metaphysics, right? It's not that the metaphysics as such motivates you to do metaphysics. Like the whole, like, and this is where I have an issue with like Bard when he says like, I do philosophy for philosophy's sake. It's like, no, you didn't. There's no way you just started doing philosophy because of philosophy. Like you did it because something, some situation, something particular happened that forced you to move in that direction. So in that sense, you're not doing philosophy for philosophy's sake. It's like, and maybe like, you know, like I know a guy out here. I know Bard's gay, so I'm making this connection. It's like I know a guy in LA who does philosophy about, you know, like very much LGBTQ type of like philosophical thinking, and it's because he got fucking exiled by his families from the Midwest. You know, it's like you're focused on this philosophy because you got fucking fucked for being gay. That's what happened. And like, so you're really doing philosophy because you didn't get accepted by mommy and daddy for being gay. That's why you do philosophy, not because it's for philosophy's sake or for the sake of to enjoy, just to enjoy. Like, I do push back on that Lacanian notion of like, you do like jouissance is to enjoy, just to enjoy. No, you enjoy, you might enjoy just to enjoy after the fact, but what actually puts you on the trajectory of enjoyment was a particularity, in my opinion. But sorry, you wanted to respond to.
Can I just? I have to jump off for a meeting. I have a different. I think. Yeah, I more or less disagree. I think with everything Lubert just said, in the sense that, and Clayton in the comments just pointed something out that I think is correct. I think the incidents are incidental. The inciting incidents are entirely incidental to the quest for metaphysics. You know, I'm looking out over, this is my view right now. And I see those two sort of, you know, outlets for heat or whatever those two bizarre little trumpets, bassoons are sticking out of that building. And it looks like art to me. And there is no inciting incident. It makes me think about my mortality, not because anything happened, not because I almost died, but because, as Clayton said, I've been sort of thrown into this existential predicament. Simply the existential predicament of being a physical form that will die is sufficient to engage someone in metaphysics. The category or the inciting incident is so broad that it simply can't be pointed to, in my case anyway. And frankly, I am not attracted to philosophy or metaphysics that does have something you can point to, like, I'm gay and this is how to deal with being gay. I'm straight and this is how to deal with being straight. I like a woman. How do you date? Like, I appreciate Javier's focus on like a dating metaphysics, but I'm not drawn to it because it's too site specific. It's just not, it's not my vibe. And it's not what draws me in. But I will leave on the most cynical note I can possibly think of, which is that the overriding reason for me deciding whether or not something is worth it is I oscillate between two things. One, I think humanity is extraordinarily stupid. And two, I hope humanity becomes far more intelligent in the future. The only reason I do almost anything is posterity. The only people I feel like I'm in competition with are Mozart and the Beatles. There's no way I can consider myself in competition with my contemporaries because I find everyone, including myself, just stupid and paltry. When I think of the decisions that we make as a society, or I think about what qualifies as art, like what people think is amazing art. It is so disheartening that it either makes me need to stop or I need to find a different reason to do art, which is some distant posterity, some metaphysical audience that is not represented in physical form today. And when I think lastly about this idea of friendship, there's this great little interview with Orson Welles where an interviewer says, you know, into the 70s, Orson Welles' catalog starts to really fall the fuck off. He's making, you know, objectively shitty movies. They're interesting and I love them, and the interviewer says, do you think that casting your friends and involving your friends in your movies has degraded the integrity of your art? And he says, 100%, absolutely. But I do it anyway because friendship is more important to me. But it absolutely screws everything up. Now, for him, that's great. But for posterity, for me, being a fan of art, it sucks. Because Citizen Kane and Touch of Evil are masterpieces, and I would have liked a few more of those. And so what are we doing this for? Who are we doing this for? And those are the questions I ask myself. And anyway, sadly, I have to jump off right now and get into this meeting or real world shit. But I'm so glad to just jump back on for a second. I hope to see you guys next Thursday. I'll try and jump on more regularly.
Well, it's wonderful to have you, Alex. Thank you for making the time. And I love those tensions. Looper, please.
I'll just try to make this point very quick because I know you have to go. Because you're writing a novel, it's a story, right? The biggest problem in most stories, and this is very Hegelian, is inciting incidents are not incidental. The main character is actually deeply involved in it, and they ironically create the inciting incident. So when you put that in perspective and you map that onto whatever, when you're doing art, when I say friendship, it's like also the art itself is your friend. It's not necessarily like a tangible person, like, oh, I'm working with my friend. Because I'll tell you right now, when I'm working with my best friends, they are not my best friends when I'm working. When I'm working, I'm yelling.
I hear you, but I disagree. I think all incidents are incidental. Otherwise, you don't have anything resembling a character. If all characters have their motivations due to incidents, then they are just flopping around without any motivating character. You have to have that fundamental character flaw, like, Jack Geddes in Chinatown, right? It's not just the incident makes him afraid of being a fool.
Well, that's my point. That is my point.
He is intrinsically afraid of being a fool, and the incident is completely incidental to revealing his character. So my point is that incidents are not the reason we do things. They reveal an underlying character.
Right.
Sure.
So that's what I mean by the character is creating their own inciting incident, because they do have that flaw that creates the space for that external force.
But it's not why you do philosophy. For instance, for me, I don't do philosophy because of an incident. The incident reveals the reason I do philosophy.
I get that. I'm trying to say the incident even exists in the first place because you had a fundamental flaw that erupted from a particular situation. Whether you cognize that particular...
But that particular situation may very well be birth, is my point. It may be as broad as birth and the existential predicament. But I really do have to go.
Sorry, go.
Okay.
Have you, Alex? No, I think that's a wonderful tension. I appreciate you all both talking about that, and it has me reflecting on my own life now. And I'll throw it to Daniel and then Greg. It's very interesting because, like, if I think about that example of going to the creek and the conversation of going midday or later in the day, there's a reason where that encounter in common life was an incident that brought about a conversation about the distinction between the probable and the possible. But then that distinction between the possible and probable, you may only be having that conversation because you have a mode of being of which exceeds, and I think this is what we're getting at, that exceeds just that incident, that maybe the incident brings out to realize, but then the conversation about the distinction between the probable and the possible is supposed to have a broader appeal than just that one decision. Like, it becomes more abstract, it becomes more universal. So there's an interesting relationship where the incident is a realization, but most people, I mean, there's also the issue where I do think there's a kind of choice here, because I think most people have a disagreement or a conversation about going to the creek, and it doesn't lead to an abstract reflection on the difference between possible and probable. It just leads to an argument or a disagreement, right? And so then there's kind of the question of why for some people, why for some people could it be used for art or discussion or others? And then that could just be the human predicament. Mr. Luber, you want to say something?
Yeah. If he were to stay on, I would have asked the question, because like I understand what he's saying, and we are basically saying the same thing when he's saying the flaw and that kind of stuff. But the reason why what I'm saying might get misconstrued is because, like, when I was saying to him, why did you do music versus storytelling or painting? Like, why was that the passion that you did? Like, the question of the story with the inciting incident, the most prevailing one is the why now. Like, why this incident versus another incident? And what that brings out is that the subject is directly involved in why it's that incident. It's not just some, like, from the sky that this incident plops down because it was fated to be. It's like, no, there's destiny. There's like, you are directly involved in the external force. Like, you can't, there actually, in a certain sense, isn't a difference between you and the external force because you're like so directly involved. So, like with that being said, it's like, because you're so directly involved, my point is that you can't separate the valence from the metaphysics, because for you to even see the metaphysics, you have to be directly involved, which the ergo brings a valence. Like, there is a valence. Like, the valence is the subjective element, right? And like in a story, it just doesn't happen by coincidence. It happens, like, if it seems coincidental, what happens in a good story is that it's revealed that it's not coincidental. Like, if the whole story was coincidental, then it's like, why did the story have to be told now? Like, why now? Like, why do I care then? That's all my point is. But yeah, go ahead.
No, I think it's very interesting. I'll give it to Daniel and Greg. I mean, for me, it's interesting to think that therefore there is something about the radical particular that actually unveils the universal, right? Like, actually, but then what is interesting is that also, though, there's a move of in the particular, then moving for something for all of time that is universal, of which is found in the radical particular, as opposed to pressed down. And so then, I mean, part of the issue, I think what you're saying is that the split between the metaphysical and the physical, if you will, is problematic. But then, of course, the problem is that is a real split in the world that has had causal effect, right? I mean, that's something that people have done. And I guess for me personally, that's where I think at the foundation of an abstract thought, I want it to be based on an encounter and a surprise and something that has happened in common life. But what has happened in common life is precisely to have a kind of universal significance. Now, there's way more to be said, but let me give it to Daniel and Greg here. Daniel, please.
All right. I've watched this podcast a couple times. I think it's called like Solomon and Smith, two British guys, and they just what do you say, like, shoot the shit for a good portion, and sometimes it just extends. They're just chatting. It's very British. I've probably enjoyed that the most, like this sense of like just these British guys with a particular kind of humor, like a dry and interesting stuff, but they're just kind of chatting. And they guessed, and then something can shift the register. Like, what makes it so that the opportunity was there? What conditions and opportunity arising, or who does what? Like, how? Because that okay, there does seem to be like a shift in this complete tangent, but we have a snake that just it seemed to escape its cage. We can't find it. Yeah, a couple of years ago, like, I was really conversing with friends, like, what does it mean to serve the good of another? Can you even know the good of another? Like, what does that mean? I mean, it was occurring within dialogue. So then it's like, what is one doing in dialogue? What are you aiming for? And at that stage, I was thinking in terms of mutually unfolding, increasingly shining intelligibility. I think I was over positivizing the logos in that sense, and intelligibility. So, for instance, pathos needed to be integrated, and that was a kind of a process, but it broke that dialogos emphasis. And just to float hypothesis that I've been thinking in relation to the root and rhizome series. my my hypothesis is the effort to count and weigh a singular loss. You can say this in different ways, but like negativity, loss, or it localized for me in grief. So the Hegelian thing of tarrying with the negative. Existentially, I think that's grieving. So the hypothesis then is the effort to count and weigh the worth of a singular loss. Daniel, I actually get this from the book of Daniel. When the hand of God comes into the banquet, and it writes on the wall, counted, weighed, divided. So like count, weigh. I'm putting divided and valuing essentially in the same spot. But it's a beautiful micro image of forms of justice. But not to digress, the hypothesis is the effort to count and weigh a singular loss is the root affordance, is the root affordance to the rhizome. But transversal was somewhere in there. The idea being the negative, that singular loss is the root affordance to the rhizomatic thing. So I just to like splice this into the incident, I wonder like if there's like a telos of whatever launches one's effort incidentally, if that goes towards a negativity. And so when I was thinking about this in relation to food or knowledge as food, it's like in scripture we mentioned it, but I brought it in like milk. I fed you milk because you start speaking about scripture and Michael arrives. But so like milk, and then I gave you meat, and then the Eucharist seems to be this meal of something that you can't be reconciled with, that you can't metabolize. You're eating loss. Like what? So I mean, I'm just putting this category of something to know that can't be known, but nonetheless you eat it. Like what is it to do that, to be constituted by that in the effort to eat? I think that the moment. So beyond the pathos, then the negative as that transversal root affordance of the rhizome. I didn't expect to have the opportunity to present my thinking there, but it's been slowly cooking in the background, and it's actually quite a relief, or to get it off my chest. that is the, but it's that snake maybe that's around here putting me on edge. There's some meditation teachers that say you should live your life as if there's a very dangerous snake in your room. This attentiveness, Yeah, but yeah, I like a sweet.
Well, I hope the snake does not nuzzle with you when you sleep, and I hope that you do find it. I have come into this house and found like a giant black snake in the hallway. Michelle also has a great story of there being a black snake climbing up the wall. It's really something, and you tell yourself that they keep away the poisonous snakes. We don't actually, maybe that's just something you tell yourself to be okay with it, but I hope that snake in your house doesn't get you, Daniel. And Mr. Satori, good to see you, and Clayton, thank you so much. And no, I mean, there's definitely something for me at the root, and then I'll give it to Greg and Andrew here. On this, there is something about the question, is lack nothing or is lack not nothing, as we put it? That is the root that actually then affords the rhizomatic possibilities. And so it's the question of the quality of the lack, of which does not give itself in the experience of it, that then requires an absolute choice to decide. And I think that then what brings you in your life to make that decision is an interesting question, I think. But I think it's just very interesting, that question that Luber and Alex are asking, because when I think, like, if I say I'm going to make a story about friendship, that doesn't work. Like, it can't have an end ahead of time, right? you have to create a situation with characters that something then occurs that like that activates something that then is not so much an end. Well, it's not so much a point as it is a certain unfolding of an experience. And I think Luber would agree with that. Because, and I think likewise, which is interesting with philosophy, is that if you say, I'm going to do a philosophy about, yeah, I'm just thinking of my own experience. Did I ever one day say I'm going to do a philosophy about belonging? I don't think I did. I think I found like the experience of the world brought about experiences and thinking of which then the word belonging captured based on Reef and Berger and other people that you speak about. But then, of course, there's something about the work that just wants to not be about simply what people mean by belonging. It's kind of reaching beyond that, that it has some sort of excessive character to it. And then I guess if I'm asked what is Turn the World about, there's something I would say, you know, I could use a line like, it's about a situation where everything you've wanted in life is right in front of you, but you don't have the eyes to see it. And yet it's also not just about that. So I'm thinking about that, but I have to pause. I'll pause and throw it to Greg here and there and Andrew. Greg, please.
Yeah, I have responses to a few things going all the way back to the very beginning of the conversation. So I guess I'll just work my way backwards. But first, I want to say it's great to find out that people have, everybody seems to have artistic pursuits, not just philosophical pursuits. People are working on novels and songs and films and things like that. So I like being in a group of people who have that going. And I also enjoy the back and forth and the disagreement. So I don't absolutely disagree with everything that Andrew said, but I think he's being too absolute about it. I think you could, maybe roughly kind of talk about, on the one hand, the influence of circumstances and incidents and events on the creation of art. But then on the other hand, for me at least, and this might sound too mystical to some people, but for me, I'm a songwriter, and I feel like much of the time, maybe not every time, but much of the time, the songs just like come to me, and they like a cat that adopts you, a stray cat that shows up and says, we're going to be in a relation, and then you have to take the cat. It's not that, and you could see that as a circumstance, I suppose, but the circumstance is that this otherworldly being, which is a song or an idea for a novel, comes to you, and then you make your life work around manifesting it. And, then on the other hand, some people, or sometimes people are inspired to write a song because some event happens in the world and they want to be able to comment on it, or, something like that, or such like that. And so maybe some people develop a philosophy because it's a way of coping with some actually important thing that affects them in their life, and somebody needs to say it, and so they're saying it. But other times, it is more of a rarefied kind of thing where it just chooses you as its spokesperson. And then I think that these things interact, and so when the art is primarily, kind of coming in of its own accord, maybe it benefits from having some unexpected influences from circumstances. Like if you write a song and then you're recording it, and you wanted to have one friend play lead guitar on it, but they were sick, so you went to this other person that you wouldn't have thought of initially, and then they actually do something brilliant that you wouldn't have had if you had gone with the first person, or you're writing a short story, and your computer dies and you completely lost the story, but then you do it again, and then the second time, you don't actually replicate exactly word for word the first, but because of the weird interaction between your memory of the first and the way you can't remember the first somehow kind of comes out even cooler than it would have come out if you'd not had the hard drive crash, that kind of thing. So yeah, so I just feel like it's a little too reductive to kind or Alex isn't here to actually give his own biographical account, but the speculation, why did he pick music 20 years ago rather than novel writing? Well, I might imagine that he picked music because music overwhelmingly called to him and he couldn't live without trying to take this feeling of music that he had and getting it out in the world. And novel writing was not calling to him at the time. That's how it would have been if it was me. Okay, so that's that. And then just wanted to say about like useless philosophy or useless art. And somebody was talking about smelling flowers on a hike. I think that for art or philosophy that, maybe sort of seems useless on the surface, it's like smelling flowers. It's like whether it's a piece of art that's, easy to say it's beautiful or compelling, or it's a like, high abstract concept that we call philosophy, we're often motivated to do it because it's just kind of beautiful and cool and intriguing to think about. And and it might be sort of useless on a practical level, but that would be like saying that having a flower garden is useless, and it's not. And then very beginning of the conversation, we were talking about having a creative idea and then putting it aside for some time to see what happens, to see if it still is valuable or whatever. And that just got me thinking, I don't have an answer to this, but it got me thinking about how, and I'll actually tie this kind of into the inspiration versus circumstances debate. It's funny to think that if you create a piece of art, very rapidly and, fully in the throes of your inspiration, and you get the idea and you manifest it and you're done and it's great. And it really is, good, and ready to go out in the world. But the funny thing is that if it's good, then other people who like it and you yourself, the creator, you're going to end up having like 20 years of living with this piece of art and sort of seeing all the wrinkles and seeing it from different points of view. And when you were in the act of creating it, you only had like 2 days or something. And so, and people have made great art in 2 days or in an hour or in 5 minutes. But on the other hand, there is value in maybe having the initial idea and then circumstances, and here's where the circumstances prevent you from completing it in a timely fashion. And then maybe that's actually good because over the 6 months that you got delayed, you listened to the recording that you already had made many times and you realized things about it. And so the final product gets the benefit of the living with the art that might not have happened if you had moved really fast. And I'm not saying that one way or the other exclusively produces great art, but there's definitely value in delay and there's value in circumstances. But then at the same time, I would not accept the reduction of art always to circumstance and as opposed to sort of divine inspiration. And I'll leave it there.
No, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. No, I think there's a lot there. And certainly there is something about how we define use and useless, like even trapped in that language kind of leaves out thinking about like having a garden. Like Michelle and I will talk about like how, just like with the tomatoes, a single plant, it's like such an excess. There's so many tomatoes, right? Would it be more efficient if it just had like 5 or whatever? But it's funny because the excess increase, obviously the excess increases the likelihood that it reproduces and things like that. But it's interesting how life has a certain, but then of course you can ask, is it useful to stay alive, right? You get that kind of fundamental question, or what's the proper proportion of tomatoes and things. But there's something about how life has a natural kind of excess to it, a natural kind of abundance, right? And it's interesting to think, is abundance useful, right? Well, there's something about the mind that says, no, not abundance. It's about the right proportion. The right amount is useful. You don't want to have too much or too little. You want to have the right amount, right? And what's interesting is how life has something abundant about it, where the like if you lose the abundance, actually, you're not going to care much about the useful. Like there needs to be something you really need, like you need to have a certain excessive experience with the smelling of the flowers, a certain full saturated phenomenon, as Marion might say, when you experience the crepe myrtle, that actually, that abundance precisely is necessary for life. I mean, honestly, I think often like my critique is that many of the pragmatic, like emphasis on use and useless and utilitarianism, and of course that's a big term for many people, leave out questions of motivation. Like something can be useful, but if people aren't motivated to do it because they haven't had this abundance of life that they've been experienced, then it doesn't matter if it's useful. They're not going to do it. I actually think a lot of the problems of philosophy has been bracketing out questions of motivation. And actually how learning how to really take in a flower can precisely motivate you to be the kind of being that does quantifiably practical things. So I think that's really, really important. I'm also now, it's very, very interesting. Because, and I'll give it to Mr. Luber here. It's very, very interesting because when I think, and actually this is making me think of a lot of like theology debates. When I experienced Heroes, I'll just say, because I know you've read Heroes, like Eve showed up. Like it was not like, it was a divine, it felt like a divine thing. Like you see this girl in a schoolroom, Eve, and you were going to bed at 11 at night, and you instead stay up till 7 in the morning writing the entire story, right? There's this kind of divine experience, right? Now, I think so there's a question here. Did I write a story because I was the kind of being who writes stories? Like that's why I did a story instead of a movie. Because you could imagine someone else being struck with the idea for Heroes and writing a story, right? But I wrote a story. So here's the question. Was the divine strike itself, did it entail being a story, or did it only entail Eve, and then I chose to make it a story, right? Like, did it, like, and that's almost like, that gets into like...
I mean, in different cases, it might have been one or the other. Like,
yeah.
Sometimes it's just a general story idea or a character idea, and then you pick the right medium, and then other times the medium is totally woven in with the divine inspiration, and
I'm thinking of writing a song, like, do I come up with the music first or do I come up with the lyrics first? And it varies from song to song, and kind of the purpose unfolds as it kind of almost writes itself a lot of the time. I believe that in the sense that I am more of a conduit for the music to come into being than I am a creator of the music. And that's just me, but that's my 2 cents to throw in real quick.
You are a beautiful soul, and Trossi is an amazingly gifted musician, and we have had so many jam sessions. I think, like, whenever we get a chance to jam harmonica and guitar, it's an event. And the end of July, I love his music. The Smile in the Dark. Check out the album, everyone. I think it is very interesting, and I'll give it to Mr. Luber here. And you said a lot there, Greg. That was really important. It is there is different experiences. Because I remember one time I can think of having a song in a dream. Like literally had the song in a dream and woke up and it had a whole story and wrote the song. That was crazy. Like I remember that, like waking up and like playing the song. That was the only time that ever occurred. And that was a kind of divine experience. But then someone else, I did it on the piano. Someone else may have done it on the harp, right? Did the dream bring with it the choice to do it on the piano? Or did it bring with it only the song and then you chose the medium, right? And then if you chose and then it could be different. And funny enough, this is a theology debate, like actually on God, like in between Catholicism, Protestantism, Christianity, and different religions, Hinduism. Hinduism's crazy on, it's actually very interesting how these questions point to a theological debate, which is, of course, the simplest way to put it is, do you have the choice to deny God? And do you have the ability to disrupt God's plan? Like if God says, Moses, do this, Did Moses, by the very hit of God's experience, in a sense, have to do it? Or and it like overrid his agency? Or to what degree, what degree is Moses or any of the religious we can go on, right? To what degree is agency part of it? And to what degree does the divine kind of eclipse the agency entirely? And of course, it can be different incidents at different times, right? Because I'm now thinking, like, I'm going to pause. I think it's a fantastic question. And there was more you said, Greg, that was really important. But let me throw it to Andrew here. Andrew, please.
I'm going to explode. I'm going to fucking explode. Okay. Let me just start with what Michael was saying in the comments, basically. And then I want to talk about, because actually I'll just start with Greg. I'll go. Notice every time you would bring up, oh, it just comes to me, right? Like, it's impossible because we use language and for the sake of just understanding, for it not to be associated to something particular. Otherwise, it wouldn't be like a sentence, essentially. Like, how can you communicate inspiration? Because nothing just comes to you, because if it comes to you, it's like, okay, it came to me at 1:36 in Los Angeles, August 6th, right? But then if I ask the question why, sure, you could just say, like, I don't know, it just did, right? But, like, if you wanted to, you could actually investigate that why. And basically you can find, and this is where psychoanalysis really, like, does this. It's like, we'll find a reason why you forgot your keys. We'll find a reason. We'll whether it's real or not, that's the whole point of Lacan, which is like the real is subject dependent. Like, he's not talking about reality outside the subject. So, like, when he says, like, you forgot your keys because this, like, the real happened. It's like something happened to the subject that made you want to forget the keys. Like, you forgot the keys because you actually didn't want to go to the appointment, because last time you went to the appointment, it was the gynecologist and it hurt. It fucking hurt. So that's actually why you forgot the keys, you know? Whether that's, like, fun, like, true outside of the subject's inquiry in that particular moment is kind of irrelevant, actually, because you could just say 2 weeks later, actually, it's a different reason. And you can explain it with the real. And 2 weeks later, you could explain it with a different reason. And honestly, this is very much analogous to writing. Most of writing is rewriting. It's not actually writing one draft. It's like you wrote the draft, but I've been rewriting. Like, I'm writing a story right now. I wrote the first draft in 2 months. I'm 6.5 months in. Most of it's rewrites, because I keep thinking I understand the theme of my story. And then I keep peeling it back, and it's like, wait, I actually don't. And then I have to rewrite to compensate. And then there's a plateau mark, basically. But I'm getting on a tangent. Basically, here's I think when Daniel, you're like, the problem is the metaphysical versus the materialist physical distinction has generated real products, generated real things in the world. That is absolutely true. But what's also true at the same time is we create different physical products that create different affects, different moods. Metaphysics, and this is why I'm saying there's a problem with valence being separate from metaphysics, because anytime there is something that's happening in reality, there is something metaphysically happening that alters your mood. Like, your existential status is more directly tied to how the physical world around you relates to your ontological status as a human being. Like, that's why you can't separate basically any kind of mental health phenomena with technology. You know, like, if you were to explain what's the problem with the male loneliness crisis, right? Well, it would be impossible to talk about it without dating apps. without the environment in which we're in. Like, otherwise, how are we going to talk about these things? How do we talk about what moods that we're in? We have to situate it in a particular situation. And the problem is everybody's existentialist. Everybody can demarcate the existential nature of a situation, or not the existential nature, but the existential valence of a situation. But they can't tie it back to its ontological roots. And that's the problem. And funny enough, this is very much, to me, synonymous with Christian dogma or Jewish dogma or Islamic dogma or any kind of dogma, because there's a separation. It's a very Kantian mode where you're separating the noumena and the phenomena, the ontological and the existential. And that's and like Heidegger's whole project was no, I'm not an existentialist. No, I'm not a phenomenologist like Husserl. He wanted to interweave the phenomenology with its ontological roots. And ironically, he gets labeled as an existentialist because the because is a tangent. I don't even want to touch on that because. So it's very hard for me. I'm not saying that a particular situation defines the idea. What I'm saying is the particular, and Daniel was 100% right on motivation. The particular situation motivated the idea. People thinking about the relationship between the environment and motivation is underthought. And a perfect example is, Michael, when you sent me the message about the inciting incident just being a nudging point that then causes the absolute choice. Now, the only way to me to push back on that is to rearrange what story structure is, right? So like, if we go based off of the Aristotelian model of there being a 3-act structure, right? Now I'm operating under that. I'm open to deconstructing that and seeing what else is there. But I think that's not a winning battle, to be honest. So within that 3-act structure, they have devised where you have exposition, inciting incident, you have pinch points, then you have your climax. Some people argue that pinch point 2 is the midpoint. I don't really give a shit about that debate. And basically, the inciting incident is taught where it's just some external force happening to you, right? But it doesn't address, and this is why it's not simply a nudge, it doesn't address how you respond to that external force. The absolute choice is the response to the external force. So how do you separate, and this is why, to me, this has to be the case. How do you separate the response and the external force? Like, how do you actually do that? Because you can't talk about the external force in a vacuum. It won't make any sense. You have to talk about it in relation to a situation which requires a response, being active, being in the world. Like, why is that external force even salient to the character? Like, that has to be established in the exposition, where the exposition, to me, is at the heart of the lack versus nothing debate. Because if there is actually nothing, then we don't need expositions. We could just jump right into the story. And you see that in today's world, where the exposition is very small, and you just jump into these stories, and it's like, here's the problem. Why do I care? Why do I care then? So the exposition needs to establish 2 things. It needs to establish what's lacking and why. Why is the character lacking? And it's so funny. You see the movie Obsession. That's like a huge movie out right now. I really love the movie. But if I, want to put on my doctor glasses and really look at the story, the issue with it is in the exposition, they establish what's lacking, but not why. They establish he's not courageous, he's lacking courage, but not why is he lacking courage, like lacking courage. And because of that, I can point to the end of the story and explain where I kind of was losing interest in these 2 minutes. We're talking about a 2-hour movie or an hour and a half movie. In these 2 minutes, you're losing me. And like most people, when you get that granular, will be like, yeah, I agree, but like that's like 2 minutes. That's like 3 minutes. Like chill out, man. You know, I get that, but like if you're striving for a good story, every second counts. Every second counts to me. And you know, we'll see. If I'm not the greatest storyteller ever, then maybe I'm wrong. But I do think when I'm done with this movie and I'm done with my stuff and I put it out, I will I will see some recognition from it. And it's because nobody, when you establish lack as why they're lacking and what is the lack, that inherently opens up a space for an external force to come in and for an absolute choice to occur, because the absolute choice is always in response to an external force. So Daniel, I love this old, I don't know if you still use this example, but like years ago, you would say, you wake up in the morning, what are you going to eat for breakfast? You have all these options, right? Well, what's making you even ask that question? I'm hungry. Okay. Well, why are you hungry? Because I haven't eaten. Oh, okay. There you go. Answer 1, answer 2, boom, done. Then you look at all the options. It's like in my kitchen, Michelle made pancakes, waffles, French toast. I have to choose. I'm hungry. Why am I hungry? I haven't eaten. I need nutrition. My body needs food. So because of that, you have to make a choice. So that's why the absolute choice has to be in the inciting incident, which it can't be in the exposition, because the exposition is just establishing the stipulations for an absolute choice to even make sense. Like the exposition.
Aren't you conflating a theory about what makes effective narrative in art with what life is like, which sometimes includes art? So, like, if I say, yeah, the song just came to me, and I was compelled to write it, it doesn't tie into what's going on in my life or some deeper part of my childhood or whatever, it just came, then that might not make for a very good story. Like you wouldn't want to have a little story about the story of how Greg Dember came to write the song. It would be a boring story. But it doesn't mean that the song's not good, and it doesn't mean that I didn't have a good experience writing the song. Where, you know, and like in real life, sometimes people wake up in the morning and they just know they want to eat breakfast, but they have no idea and they have to make a choice between many things. But other times people wake up in the morning and they've got a strong desire to have blueberry pancakes, and then they'll do whatever it takes to get blueberry pancakes that morning, and the other options aren't even considered. Um, and you know, you may be right that in constructed narratives, kind of, you know, one of it makes for better storytelling when there's kind of a chain of causation and things like that, than if everything that happens in the narrative is just, oh, it just happened to be that way. Oh, it just happened. Oh, it was a coincidence. Or yes, that would be a dumb story. But that doesn't prove that life doesn't happen that way, and that a compelling, worthwhile life might not happen that way.
Yeah, I mean, I hear that. I struggle with. I wrestle all the time for years with my philosophy on story, whether it's actually mappable onto life itself. I think that's totally a fair potential critique. What I formulated in circulating this concern is that if you were to keep asking questions, you will have to have an answer. So, like, if I put a gun to your head and I say, why did you want blueberry pancakes? You might even come up with a lie. You might even say, because when my mom, I saw on Instagram this awesome person making blueberry pancakes, and like that suffices as an answer, right?
Yeah, and if we were making a movie where somebody woke up craving blueberry pancakes and then somebody broke into the house and held a gun to their head and asked them to, why, that might make for good storytelling. If the thing they made up on the spur of the moment was actually like a really interesting story and it revealed things about them and their relationship with their mother, which wouldn't have come out otherwise, and blah, 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 blah. But in real life, that doesn't change the fact that in real life, when somebody wakes up craving blueberry pancakes, maybe just eating the pancakes is like the important part and not finding an explanation for why.
I think experientially, like linearly, absolutely. But the second is when you have language involved and you ask questions. That's when, in my opinion, it doesn't hold up. And this goes right back to the nothing versus lack distinction.
Or I mean, maybe it's just not interesting to ponder why the person craved blueberry pancakes.
Right. And that's totally fine. That's totally
Okay.
fine. But just because, here's my thing, just because something's not interesting to ask a question doesn't mean that there's some underlining thing happening that you're just not interested in. Why is there language versus no language at all? Right? Why? Because we're lacking the ability to give. I'm just going to use Kantian language just for the sake of getting the point across. We're lacking the ability to access the noumena. We have language as representations of the noumena, right? So we're lacking a certain capacity to just to communicate everything about our entirety, about being in the world, about the thing in itself, about reality, objectivity, all those things. So the second when we start having language, and like art absolutely uses language, like even painting is the language of shapes and colors, like, so there's no escaping expression and its relation to language. So because they're so intertwined in that way, you get this ability to look at the pattern as this causal chain, essentially. Now Ebert, when he says metaphysics is detached from valence, what that means is, and this is where I just need to read Hegel, because, and I know there's a debate between Hegelians, which is the movement of dialectics, does it need particularity or not? Like in the beginning of the Science of Logic, it starts with being and nothing, right? But if you go to the philosophy of right, it starts in a particularity. You go to the phenomenology of spirit, it starts in a particularity. So I know Ebert is looking at it from a very specific Hegelian perspective of just the science of logic. He's told me explicitly, like, he disregards, philosophy of right, disregards the phenomenology of spirit. He's focused on a certain section of the science of logic because he thinks that the correct articulation of dialectics will capture metaphysics as such without any valence whatsoever. And I don't agree with that, because when you start your inquiry on the proper dialectics into metaphysics, I ask the question, why are you starting now versus tomorrow? Why do you feel like doing that now? Because the thing that you can't escape is that we're mortal. We are situational based. When you are doing an activity, it will be in a world, in a situation. And this is, like, to me, like the Heideggerian point. So because every action is associated whether you're interested or not, because I agree with your point on interest, okay? But whether you're interested or not, every action is associated with the situation. And that's why it's hard for me to buy the difference, like the distinction between metaphysics as such not having a valence versus metaphysics actually having a valence. And I think if you were to watch the consequence of both thought paths, one's going to have an ethics and one's not. Like Ebert does not have an ethic. Maybe he does now because I haven't, but I've been following his stuff. I don't believe there's an ethic, and I hope he watches and corrects me if there is. But I'm pretty sure he doesn't give a shit about ethics. And I think it's because his thought path he can't think about ethics because his whole premise is precisely contingent on having no valence when thought is occurring. But the problem is thought is occurring when you're in a situation. Like you're not in a bubble. And even a bubble is a situation. Like it's unescapable. That's why, and then this goes back to lack not being nothing. And then I'll just say one more thing. I've been talking for so much. I'm sorry. The last thing is this whole conversation is totally about otherness and difference. And in the sense of you can only understand difference within a given genus. Like I can only understand the difference between yellow and brown because they're both colors. But if I were to say, what's the difference between a D flat and yellow? Right? Then it's like, okay, well, those are that's otherness. This is like a whole other topic, right? Right? But yet you still have these phenomena where it's like people hear something, hear a note, and they see a color, right? Or like Jockin told me the other day, there's a difference between a square and a circle, but together there is such thing as a squircle, right? And I did push back where it's like, well, that they're both part of the same genius. But the point is that when you do try to put otherness into difference, where it's like, well, how does the color yellow relate to D flat? You're going to be able to do that, and then it becomes its own. It becomes part of a genus. So the point is, if you were to think about metaphysics without any valence, you are essentially telling me that you are thinking about otherness without collapsing it into difference, which I would say is impossible. You can't talk about otherness without collapsing it into difference. And I understand Deleuze uses difference in a different way than how I'm using it probably. But from what I gathered, Deleuze is talking about otherness and is using the word difference, which is fine. The way I use otherness is he's talking about difference. And I'm taking otherness in the Nicholandian sense, where it's like outside. It's outside. It's completely like in that way. So Ebert to me ultimately is sounding like you can actually have access to God itself with thought. And you actually have access to otherness without it collapsing into some difference that's part of the umbrella of a certain genius. That's a human construct, that genius. That's why I typed in the group chat where nature does not have necessity. This is a point that I argued with Jockin, which he beat my ass in, which is it's ironic where it's like science is like, oh, we're finding the patterns of nature, but what if nature has no necessary patterns? Like that means that it's totally ass backwards. And that's why I like something that's law-like versus law, because law can't actually capture nature. The map isn't the territory. And if the movement of thought can actually capture something without it being associated with a valence, then we essentially transcend morality. I mean, not morality, being mortal beings. And that is, I just don't understand that. So maybe I shouldn't disagree. I should actually be more humble and say, I don't understand that. I don't. And I think that yeah, I think I said enough, but thank you.
No, not at all. That's there's a lot there that's extremely important. And I think I'm going to admit, oh, that's a giant storm cloud. So I'm sitting outside under this tree. Hopefully it's big enough to cover me. We'll see if it starts raining. But the sun's coming out, so at least it'll be a rainbow. I'll give it to Mr. DeClerc here. So arguably, not to get into the Hegel debate, there's this interesting idea that Hegel does the phenomenology in order to kick it aside for the science of logic. But then there's something about the phenomenology that was necessary to actually say that this was the moment of history that could think the absolute metaphysics. So that would kind of go to the idea that there had to be a valence in order to get to the metaphysic, right? Because he'll call it a phenomenology. Like the phenomena, like for him, history is the story. History is the valence, of which in his moment, of course, it happened to be Hegel as the absolute spirit, like Napoleon, right? But at his moment, that now history had reached the point where actually the pure metaphysics, if you will, could be realized because history had actually reached the point where that was now possible, right? And so there had to be the movement of history, and that's also the philosophy of right. Like the movement of history is actually necessary for thought. But then what Hegel wants to do is he wants to say that history has a essential role in the development of thought that is not bound to a history. Okay, so there is something that makes history necessary in order to arrive at something not bound to history. Ergo, there's something necessary to story in order to arrive at thought that is not bound to story, right? And yet it wouldn't exist without story. Well, what in the world is that? And what are you talking about, right? So basically, for Hegel, he believes, rightly or wrongly, that basically the way he is using the dialectical motion, which is an encounter with limit, that thus actually unveils a limitation that then it has to sublate into itself and so on and so forth, is the necessary movement of all variances, right? Like they all have to move this way, but you also couldn't think this thought until his moment in history, of which then retrospectively adds a non-contingent thought to all contingent thought that was realized through history that was always already. But there's a weird thing where the always already of the absolute metaphysics requires history to realize. So you needed the valence, you needed that, but then you can arrive at something that is going to be able to actually apply more universally, if you will, right? And I think, and if I were to say how maybe Mr. Ebert would counter, and I think we're going to make it, or you're going to get to watch a guy run really quickly to a garage. It's going to be hilarious. Oh, Heidi, look, he's so cute. There is a suggestion that what I would take Mr. Ebert to be saying is that I don't want a metaphysic that only applies to dating, because if it only applies to dating, then I actually would have reason to think it's false. Because if it doesn't universally apply, then it is probably actually too captured by the logic of dating and thus forms an internally consistent system, and it's probably not open. It doesn't have a girdle point, if you will, right? And I have experienced that. When people say, I'm going to write a story about X, and they decide ahead of time, or I'm going to do a philosophy about X ahead of time, then it actually is more likely to have its own logic do its thinking for it. That it actually is not going to, I am going to get to, this is going to be hilarious. It's not actually going to be able to do what it needs to be done. And yet, this is what Hegel's going to say. Yeah, I'm screwed. This is what Hegel's going to say. He's going to say something like, you actually, oh my gosh, I'm screwed. The rain is over there. Okay, let's go. Let's go. I'm going to take it up here to the umbrella. Can you open the door? Oh gosh. Oh gosh. Oh gosh. Oh gosh. I'm going to put it here. Okay. All right. I really thought I had a chance, guys. I really thought I had a chance. All right. Thank you, honey.
Unreal.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Okay. Okay. All right. I need a towel or stuff. We're talking about story and all the important stuff. Okay. All right. All right. All right. Yeah, I think that'll work. Okay. I need a towel. If this computer blows up, paper towel. Oh, wow. Look at that. Look at that. Oh, good times in Virginia. Good times in Virginia. Does that count as a valence or a metaphysic? Now, what is the metaphysic that the absolute limit of computers meeting rain helps us realize as a phenomenology for the subject? I think that's good. But anyway, there is something about what Hegel wants to suggest is that basically The absolute metaphysic, and this is where I think, assume this computer's still working, I'm actually not sure, is that for Hegel, you have to have history because the absolute metaphysic only actually comes, it is always following from an encounter of limit, okay? And you can only encounter limits in a valence. Like you have to be in a particular thing. Well, every single possible valence, every possible story is by definition infinitude. Therefore, their very particularization is what affords the universal abstract metaphysic, but that can only be known through the encounter of limit, right? But then Hegel's going to say, but because that limit actually opens you up universally, it is not bound to the limit. That's the weird move. That is the insanely weird move, is that the encounter of limit is actually beyond a particular valence because it is afforded in all possible valences, okay? So it's not over story, it's not over the, but it's an all possible. So then the metaphysic, yes, exactly, the limit and the boundary are different. And so that then would mean that when you're talking about a universal metaphysic or etc., what you are saying is that there is no possible story of which cannot follow this unfolding. And for Ebert, the suggestion would be that if you focus on, say, a philosophy of dating, you're likely to come up with a metaphysic, and not because, like he said, I think what Javier did on that is wonderful. I'm just using that example because what he was talking, and in fact, actually thinking seriously and philosophically about dating is desperately needed today. But the risk of that, which I agree with, no more than talking about a phenomenology of the artist if I'm not careful, but the risk of that is you're likely going to arrive at a metaphysic. Like, let's put it this way. It is extremely unlikely that a philosophy of dating or a philosophy of art is going to entail the limits of that very philosophy. It is very unlikely that a philosophy of art, let's say, is going to entail the limits of that very philosophy of art, right? Like, it's not going to entail the limits of that very philosophy of art, right? And then the argument would be the only way to actually successfully entail the limits of the philosophy of art is to start talking about fruit, is to start talking about armies, the different and otherness point, right? Like you have to talk about something that is different in genus, right? So because otherwise, let's say you say, well, to talk about the limits of art, I'm going to talk about the limits of music. Nah, come on now. That's too similar, right? Like Hegel would be very suspect. I totally tore my pants. Oh my God. Like the suspect of would be very suspicious of that, right? And then he would also be suspicious of the subject doing a philosophy of art to come up with something adequately other that would actually fully reveal the limits of the philosophy of X. Do you see what I'm saying, right? And so he's looking for a way to talk abstractly that would actually bring out the philosophy of dating that entails the limits of the philosophy of dating. That's what Hegel, in my opinion, wants. He wants to say, I want every possible philosophy of X to also entail in that philosophy the limits of philosophy of X, right? And that is not going to occur if you are not aiming for something more universal. But then whatever universal you arrive at has to apply, it has to be constituted by the movement of finitude itself, not over the movement of finitude, right? And then, of course, there's an idea where you needed a quote-unquote phenomenology, movement of history, inciting incident that is Hegel himself, by which you would come to actually realize that is the absolute history. And so then, of course, I mean, if you make an ethic, the ethic I would come up with, I think Alex would agree with, is going to be all about encounterology, all about an ethics of how to handle surprise, wit, all the stuff you talk about, the Friends of the Beautiful. Those conversations be great. And Clayton, you are awesome at the Friends of the Beautiful discussion. I really enjoyed that. And Javier, and I didn't get a chance to comment, but the recent one was really good. But what you're referring, like the function of story is the function of history for Hegel, in my opinion. And the function of, and then also he wants to suggest, he wants to show that the movement of history is isomorphic with the movement of phenomenology, that those things actually all go together, which then would be evidence that there is, like you were saying, what's the difference between, the color yellow and D sharp or whatever, right? Like, oh, look, history and phenomenology. Most people would be like, those are opposites. Well, actually, that has us think thoughts we couldn't think before, like this, like seeing music, seeing colors, right? You overlap those things that are other, then actually that creates something transversal. And yes, Deleuze does use those terms differently, so forgive me if I confuse them as well. I think you know what I'm saying. But actually, that's why the great joke is the argument that Deleuze is Hegelian without really knowing it, because that operation of the transversal, which is the universal metaphysics, is actually the same thing that Deleuze is going for, and arguably Hegel is doing the same thing, but you have to have the overlaps. But then what this would kind of mean is that the quote-unquote inciting incident is actually a kind of moment of overlap, that there's this kind of overlap that leads to a transversality, that there's also a way in which there are, dare I say, there are different kinds of inciting incidents. There's the inciting incident of dropping a cup on my foot that then makes me pissed off and it doesn't open up reality. And then there's the biting into a cookie in Proust that then starts, the remembrance of lost time, right? There's that delta factor in Walker Percy. And that inciting, and then I suppose the argument is a suggestion that a story of which will be able to maintain care throughout is going to be a inciting incident that is more like the biting into a cookie in Proust, or more like a delta factor, than it is going to be dropping a cup on my foot. And yet there is also then something where learning how to not go crazy when I drop a cup on my foot and acting virtuous actually could open up the possibility of a delta factor moment as Walker, or a strike of beauty, right? Like, so then, and then it will be as if the incident of dropping the cup on my foot was always already part of the story logic, right? Because it has that retrospective thing, right? And yet, in isolation, the dropping of the cup on my foot is not actually in a story logic to itself. It's just a random incident, and that actually I can live a good life by just responding to coincidence as well, right? And I think also then that gets into the stuff where like there's a weird thing. If we take the fear of error as the fear of truth, and then I'll give it to Mr. de Klerk and Mr. Satori, and I guess the computer's still working. That's where basically there's something here as well, where if you are afraid of error, what Hegel is basically saying that you're not going to have truth. So likewise, weirdly, I think if you try to make everything in your life a story, it's not storied. Like, actually, if you say, I'm going to make everything a story, I'm going to make sure there are no coincidences and stuff like that, you actually are never going to have the, dare I say, more metaphysical inciting difference that kind of opens you up to the strike of beauty, right? But that means we have to be intentional about, not like intentional about happenstance, like intentional about gathering and not always having knowing the meaning of it or fitting it into a story, right? And then that would also mean that the moment of the opening to the absolute choice, well, has to choose you more than you choose it. And I think that's the tension, right? Like there has to be this moment, like, and I think like I've experienced, like Greg was saying, there's this moment where Eve shows up. And then it turns out that day when you dropped the cup on your foot, that was a random coincidence, is actually something that you can bring into the story. And so then it's as if that moment was always already going to be part of the story, but it was only so activated by Eve showing up, right? And then, of course, the giant metaphysical question is that Hegel would be asking, in my opinion, is what must the nature of reality be like in order to unfold this way? To have a cup land on your foot as a coincidence that then in the future, you can retrospectively make it part of an unfolding that actually is thanks to being activated by Eve, right? Like, what is metaphysically the nature of reality in order to do that? Now, you could just say lack is nothing and it's coincidence and we just make random connections and have to, and Deleuze is like, that's kind of the thrust. Or what if there's actually something deeper in operation, right? That there's that's a deeper kind of unfolding. And then, you can take absolute idea as God at the end of Hegel, right? And you can kind of get into that sort of stuff. But I'm going to stop and give it to Mr. de Klerk and then Mr. Satori. Mr. de Klerk, please.
Okay. I'm going to try and propose something that'll probably break down halfway through. I'll realize is crap, but that's part of the fun. Okay. I feel like if you are already living in a way that, in a manner in which you feel like you're living a story, like if you feel like there is an arc to your life, that your life is more than a random happenstance of events, that like history is more than a sum total of events, that there's like something more going on, that you're not just a bunch of like you know like lottery ball just cells ping ponging back and forth, that there's kind of like a moral and like ontological arc to your life. Then the experience of events that other people may brush off as coincidences or as like meaningless um events, you will like metabolize in a way that like you can integrate into your story or like your frame of reality. So like things will happen that will force you to, and maybe it causes you to like deconstruct your story or deconstruct your map of how like reality works. But like nevertheless, there's a sense in which there's like an unfolding, that things are not just purely random. It's like when people say everything happens for a reason, like, and a lot of people, think that that's just like really cliche. I think that's kind of the like deeper sense of it is like, but then there's ditches on like either side of the road where like some people then think every single thing is like this monumental like illumination from God, and like I have to like pay attention to this. And then it's just like the combinatorial explosion of like the entropy of the universe. um but I think like what Andrew is saying, I think like that's how I was like trying to understand it with what Alex was saying of like, if you live in such a way that, and I think like not just a story that you've created, but like I think this is where like tradition and religious belief or like spiritual belief comes in, where like if you're living in like a time-honored story that like feels like it chose you as opposed to you choosing it. Like Daniel, you have that great line of like, people don't want to choose, they want to be chosen. And that like that's kind of like the way I see it is like that's kind of like that's like an instantiation of a limit, right? Like you're almost, in like almost every kind of superhero story or story of like where someone has some sort of powers, it's usually like they were chosen for it, right? Like Peter Parker gets bitten by the spider, Harry Potter, gets marked by Voldemort. Like they don't choose to be those people. It's like they're marked for better or for worse. They're that's kind of like their destiny. So like there's that of like, if you already live in a story, you feel like the things that happen to you become the situation. I think that's what Andrew was saying. It's like there's like a situation that things happen in a context. Like context matters, and I totally agree with that. I think that's kind of like the like and maybe he like would push back on this, but I think that's kind of like part of the like postmodern like argument is like, you can't disentangle things from their context, from their like social, from the era that you're in, from the time period, from the place, from the like, I see this in therapy work where like there are people that come in, and I think this is often what happens in like spiritual bypassing, is like where people try and jump to a like oneness, like unification of mind, body, spirit, without addressing the context in which they were raised, for example, that brings with it like certain barriers and complications to like healing. And but then there's like the other side of it, and I'll pass it back. Like the other side of it is like when a moment happens, when you encounter like a really wise person, or when something really tragic happens to you, and it's like a waking up. It's like a waking up from a sleep of some sort, where like you actually shift from a place of relative like unstoriedness to realizing like your place, I don't know, your place in the world. I don't have a good word for it, but like where you actually go from a state of unconsciousness to consciousness. And but I think critically, it's like it's not like just in that moment and into the future you start living or start becoming more aware. It's like your past makes more sense to you as well. Like everything that led up to that moment, like it's like everything fits, everything starts to like fit where it didn't fit before. And I think as like I was tending to agree more with Andrew, because I think he was trying to like emphasize that point is like for people to choose music over something or another, like maybe it's just I was born to be a musician, and it was like as simple as that. But like often it's like you hear stories of like great musicians or other people who genuinely thought that they were going to be something else. They were like, no, I was going to be a this, and then they maybe failed at that or something, and they just were like playing their instrument one day, and it's just like something shifted, or like they met someone who just like saw something in them when they didn't see. So it's like, yeah, like I do believe in those like 4 or 5 just like critical moments in someone's life where and it's a mysterious thing. It's like was a new self like created or invented in that moment, or were you just allowed to reveal the self that was already there, that just didn't have oftentimes they didn't have the container, which then goes back to context. Like you didn't have the context to write your story or to play your instrument because that was never encouraged, or you're never given the opportunity or whatever. So it's a mysterious thing, like the time thing, and like Eliot's line, like time present and time future were always present in time past. Like it is this kind of cyclical thing of like was this moment like necessary in the unfolding of my life, or was my life already like, was it always leading up to this? Was there always the writer in there? It was just manifesting itself in different ways, or was this moment like necessary for the writing career to be birthed and to start and all of that? Yeah, but I'll pass it back there.
Oh, that's getting at a bunch of important things. So, Hegel so what you're describing is an experience that is quote unquote as if there's a meta law, like there's a metaphysical necessity, right? So basically, you could say the crown jewel of philosophy is basically to suggest there is something in reality like that without a top-down necessity. Now, Mr. Luber's going, theme, but like, so you notice that experience that has a certain sort of like had to have been this way, right? So Hegel does not want to say that there is something external from reality, thus making a dualism instead of a monism. He wants to say there is something in what reality is that is able to actually create that effect. But then you have a problem, because how do you not universalize that effect and say that all phenomenon must have a meta law? Because that in of itself would be a meta law, and actually would be saying contingency is an illusion. Okay, so what you have to do is somehow have a metaphysic that makes all categories in Daniel, thank you for being here, especially so late, and I'll give it to Mr. Satori here. Like, all categories must be valid. If you say a single category is an illusion or is no good, it's great to have you, Greg. Thank you for coming, sir. If you say contingency is an illusion, like metaphysics is a history of saying one category is like an illusion or something, right? Like, actually change is false. Actually, contingency is false, right? And that's a way that you can get a kind of meta law, is by simply saying that some things that seem to be real are actually not, and actually at the core, change is an illusion and being is good, or something like that, right? Well, Hegel rejects that, because you have to present a presupposition, which says change is false. Okay, how'd you arrive there? Was that given by the phenomenon? Because when I look out in phenomenon, all I see is change. And if you're telling me it's an illusion somehow, where'd you get that? And so then, of course, you get the famous notion of becoming. But what I'm getting at, because there's a lot, and this is really, really important. What I'm getting at is that it would seem that reality allows both meaningless events, but then also events of which seem bound by a meta law, or that are law-like, not actually a meta law, but meta law-likeness, I want to say, right? Like, it has a feeling of necessity that in of itself actually is contingent. And here's the thing, there's a certain sense in which I want to say that you really truly can live, dare I say, a meaningless life, and those are the stakes. Like, the stakes are that you truly, in a real sense, can live a meaningless life. But that precisely is part of the structure that affords the meaning that actually then creates this meta law likeness. Like, you have to make the possibility of meaninglessness, coincidence, pure coincidence, as actually part of, dare I say, the mechanism of the meaningfulness, right? Like, because in a certain sense, you can just say that it's all coincidence. In a sense, that is precisely your choice. You actually afford that choice. And the issue is, if you want to say, the problem with asserting everything is meaningful is because you're not waiting on, dare I say, the inciting incident to actually unveil how so. Like, it's not unveiling it to you, you are choosing it, right? And it's almost like everything might have a meaning. Like, it's like everything potentially has a meaning, but then you have to do certain things in certain times in order to be at the place of the inciting incident that would unveil that which was always already, right? And then there is something about reality where the subject is real, and the choice of the subject not to so act really does make a reality that doesn't have meaning, that doesn't have a story, because the subject is part of reality. But that possibility in reality is for the possibility of story, in the way that Luber is saying, right? Like, that is a necessary structure that affords a necessity. That's the only way you're going to get a necessity that is not a meta law, but instead it's a necessity that's going to be meta law likeness. And that has to then be afforded by the structure of finitude itself. Like, finitude itself, all possible finite phenomenon have to entail the possibility of this meta law likeness relative to how the subject chooses to participate in the unfolding of history, of which then is not going to be bound to a single historic episode, but would actually be what was being unveiled in every possible historic episode. But it was not until Hegel that there was the historic episode by which all of this could be realized. And then you could also argue that even if it was so realized, we seem not to have gotten it. And so even if that realization was there, you then needed all the philosophers afterwards to give their different accounts by which you could realize that which was always already. So then there's a funny kind of idea that actually, even if the right articulation was there, you may not have the eyes to see it unless you have everything after the story. And that amnesia, that process could go on forever. That could be how memory and forgetting is actually itself part of the continuation of the Hegelian philosopher after Hegel, right? And so that then, but then it is also truly ontologically possible not to realize any of that, because if not, the entire bounding of your life into a meta law-like necessity would of itself be meaningless or empty, or the subject, it would mean the subject is not real, that the subject didn't have a real role. They were simply tracing out something that was transcendent, right? And so then basically that's why it can kind of be a mistake to say everything has a meaning, and yet it's also correct that everything has a meaning, because it's relative to your conditionality and unfolding and courage in the life, so that an inciting incident could occur that always already makes things realized as such. But if you do not do that, if you do not do the things of courage so that inciting incident can occur, it really will be as if your life did not have meaning. And it won't be the case that reality had meaning that you didn't realize, because you, in your structuring of it, did not make that an optionality. But that pure closing off is actually precisely the very same mechanism that affords meaning. So in that sense, it is actually on a deeper ontological level meaningful. That's the weird move. And that is always already in operation. But you see, this is why Hegel wants to say appearance is not the opposite of reality. What appears is real. The appearance is real. The appearance is not what keeps you from the noumenon. It's how the noumenon unveils itself, and that it is actually unveiling the thing in of itself, but that's relative to your conditionality. And so it matters what you do. I'm going to stop and give it to Mr. Satori. Mr. Satori, and then I guess I'll go. But Mr. Satori, it's good to see you on this fine day.
No, you know what? So yeah, that whole like Hegel thing with history, that really popped out to me, because I was, well, you know, I can go back to the whole thing whenever I jumped halfway in and talking about like why people do art and stuff. And, you know, I've been writing fiction, but it requires me, you keep requiring me to go back into the philosophy and history and back and forth and all these things. And so this week I got stuck in this thing of like, why did Rome beat Carthage in the Punic Wars? And G.K. Chesterton wrote about it. And basically it was like, oh, well, Carthage had human sacrifice, and that would have been really bad for like God's plan if they were the people in charge instead of the Romans. And it's like, you know, and I read, you know, I'm like, yeah, that kind of makes sense. That's good. But then I was like digging into it more and really like looking at what is this, what, you know, is that all there is? And one of the things I found was very interesting was Rome, the Roman marriage customs kind of also put this sacred emphasis on monogamy, even though nobody was, exclusive. But it was very important that you and that the pater and the mater were monogamous. Whatever you did with the lower class didn't really count, but that was a sacred thing. And so I was like, well, that's okay. That's probably was like, maybe that was part of what's absent in Carthage that was also there. And then I started looking into it, and then, realized like, and this is one of these things where you couldn't say it before, you couldn't say it for many hundred years or whatever, but digging into the whole history of the thing and looking at the Carthage, their Phoenician culture there, and it was like they almost were on the same like epistemological wavelength as the people in the Enlightenment, and it really was maybe as something that shows the difference between a lack and a nothing. And I think what you're saying in that whole, like if you're going to make a meta rule where you say something is false, that's to say that the lack is nothing. And that gives you a really huge advantage in whatever you're trying to accomplish in the material world, but, ultimately is going to lead you down a dead end. And so, I was like looking into this, and, there's so much weird stuff I'm looking at, like they basically invented advertising. It was the most like commercial culture, but the way that they got there, I would say, is essentially, you could say maybe the Greeks and Romans kind of thought like humanity had this ability to kind of And that wasn't really part of the more Eastern religions. You know, those were always like, oh, the gods created humans to be slaves. Now everybody kind of balked at that, and they, rejected it. And so they get the same kind of thing popping up later on. But the Phoenicians there in Carthage, it was really weird because their religion was stuck in this very ancient mode. And I'm thinking this comes from their interactions with Israel, where they saw Israel actually really bought into this thing about like don't seek equality with God, like, and they had all this great success because of it. Now, and their thing, you know, they have it connected to this whole story of the Exodus, and you know that there's this transcendent God that's not like the gods that just create humans to do their dirty work. So it's very different. But you know, it's something in there where first they kind of do a synchronization and say, oh yes, well then what we call Baal is just the same as what you call Yahweh, and that's the highest God. And we're gonna follow your thing, and we're not gonna try to like create gods in our own image. We're just gonna we're gonna focus on our work and all this stuff. And lo and behold, they have amazing success, as does Israel, you know, during that time, you know, King David, King Solomon. Well, then Israel kind of goes off the path, and they get sucked into idolatry and all this stuff. And the interesting thing is that the Phoenicians don't really go into it the same way. I think they kind of stick to the path. But what changes is that they go to humans are not the same as God, but there is a God. To humans are not the same as God, and there is no God. They turn the difference between them and God into a nothing. And then from there, their culture just stops, and it just goes into pure acquisition. And they don't have any philosophy they develop for the next 800 years. And they just fight wars by hiring mercenaries. And it's like, it's weird. It's like weird. Like when you look into it, it's like, you know, because you kind of hear like those Owen Barfield things about like how ancient people were. And it's like, these people were modern. Like they were totally modern and just like essentially, or acquisition. It was there. Like, you know, they literally thought like, if you just like the path to a good life is just to get as much money as you can, and then you can buy whatever you want. And, you know, and so like, it kind of shows how these like stories, you know, they never said that explicitly, but it's like, oh, and this is why they just kind of gave up the fight, like why they did not really care. You know, they didn't, you know, like they were hiring, their way of waging war was just to get gold and hire mercenaries. And like, you know, then they're fighting a Roman Empire that is, you know, saying like, you know, this land was our ancestors' gift to us, and we have to, you know, and they have all this like spiritual connection to it. And it's like, well, of course they're gonna win, because they have a reason to like keep fighting even when, you know, the numbers don't match or whatever. So anyways, this conversation helps me think of that was the scenario I was thinking about. And the lax distinction, I think, really makes it clear. It's very helpful in that way. So I could talk about SummerSlam, what happened in the wrestling world too. I mean, but well, I'll just say that. So there was like a big, you know, it was like Brock Lesnar did this big passing on the torch thing, you know, and he gets beat, and they're very like, they make him look really, really tough and hard to beat, and then he loses, and everybody knew he was going to lose. And then he comes out and he shakes hands with the guy and says like, this is the future right here. This guy is the future. And it's like, that is like, it's like, you know, there's very much a lot of lack in that thing because it's a scripted, choreographed thing. But if you think about like, what's that mean to some 6 or 10-year-old kid who's watching that and stuff, and like what kind of an impact does that have, and what's that going to inspire in somebody else's imagination? And that's just to say, like, that our stories can be made up of stuff that doesn't necessarily have the same gravitas as like Homer. Everybody get upset about the Odyssey or whatever, but if it hits you in those formative moments of your life, whatever it is, like, that is going to shape your story, and it is going to have that same impact. And I guess we may be, if us being creative people are contributing to those moments in somebody else's life, maybe on a much smaller scale or in a much lesser quantity, but still makes an impact. So
Oh, magnificent. I'll give it to Mr. Luber here, and then if anyone has any final thoughts. And in fact, it would be extremely interesting to think, I know you do work on professional wrestling, and actually to think of what happens in professional wrestling in light of Luber's book on theme that he's done with Alex, because actually it is also very interesting that people, I remember watching professional wrestling and and everything, staying at the beach and so on, and how it's actually like knowing that it's fake, and yet you're still invested. Like, there's a revelation here about the role of story and care and things like that. And also, what's very interesting about professional wrestling, which I think does go to Luber's thought, is that the outcome has to be plausible. Like, it has to be plausible who wins, who loses, how the fight goes, right? If the fighting is not plausible, then, like, it's fake, and yet it has to be. It's weird because it's fake, but it's also plausible that this could have actually happened, that it actually could have gone this way based on the profile of the characters, right? And so you have to kind of absorb or have a sense that what just happened was believable. And even though it's fake, it's not fake at the same time, which I think speaks to the power of fiction and art and everything, and that actually then has a big impact on if the audience cares. I'm also, what you were saying about history, there's a very real way that Hegel, instead of these thought experiments like Rousseau or Hobbes, where the basis of a philosophy is a thought experiment, he wants it to be history. Like, he wants history to be the thought experiment. He's like, why are we coming up with these thought experiments about like a state of nature where we were all at peace, or red or tooth or claw? What do we see in history? Like, that's the basis of thought. And what you see in history is this weird, necessary encountering of limits. Like, this works for a bit, but then it hits its limit. And now it's actually going to, like you were saying with Israel, like it works, but then you hit a limit, right? But the thing is, because what you were doing worked, you would never think to not do it until you encountered the limit of its working, right? And that creates a conundrum that you basically can't escape. Like, there's no way to escape thinking that the thing that worked won't work. Like, how do you think the thought that this thing that worked and made us prosperous is actually going to start failing now? Based on what? Like, where does that come from? It has to literally fail. But that gets into story because it's like you're trapped in an irony where X does Y for Z, and Y is why you don't get Z, and you keep going, and not until the day where you literally realize something happens in history that makes you see that Y is keeping you from Z, will it be plausible to you that Y is why you don't get Z. So for me, history is a story of an irony. Like, and then it does seem as if there's something about being itself, if you will, metaphysically, that has an ironic ontology, that has this necessity of encountering limits, of which you can't think of as a limit because it wasn't a limit. Like, what Israel was doing was not a limit. It worked. It worked. And then one day it's a limit. But when is it? This gets to Luber's point. But when does it become a limit? Why now? Nobody knows. Ahead of time. It has to be encountered. So civilizations are trapped in a certain way. You're trapped in this. There has to be a moment when what worked no longer works. But you can't know why or when ahead of time, which means that civilization itself is necessarily structured to have this story-like dimension, which then here's the issue. When a civilization hits a moment of the inciting incident, to use what Luber would say, it has a choice. Do I care or not? Do I care about keeping the civilization going or not? And to care about the civilization, everyone would say, well, of course I care. No, you don't, because you don't want to give up your bad habits. You don't care about the civilization going more than you do what the bad habits that weren't bad habits at the time gave you. You see, like, you're not willing to give up the thing that was successful. So, but to keep the civilization, you have to give up the thing that made the civilization successful, or to see its limits. But how do you even think that thought? Why would you think that? So there's an innate limit in thought itself that has to play out like that. And so this is what Hegel says. There is a certain kind of inevitability in history, right? That this has to play out. But what he wants to suggest is that this inevitable structure of history where civilizations encountered the inciting incident and basically chose tragedy. They basically chose to say, we're not in a story. We're going to deny we're in a story, which then is the story in a certain regard. They're going to deny that they need to change. That was a kind of deterministic structure of history until Hegel. And then at Hegel, you can see that this was the structure. And now it's possible to choose the commedia, to use Lieber's language. It's now possible to choose to say, wait, lack is not nothing. Like, actually, that lack is important to choose. The fact that limits cannot realize their limitation, it's important to actually choose to see limit that way, or else you're not going to change at the inciting incident. And so there's a determinism to Hegel, but not as of Hegel, that then retrospectively unveils that that determinism was actually always already contingent. But at the time, you didn't realize it, so it practically functioned as deterministic. And so that then has the effect of you re-seeing everything that has occurred in history at the moment of absolute spirit in Hegel, but then we forgot Hegel. So then that very realization itself is contingent, which of course would be so then it turns out that the realization that lack is not nothing itself could be a limit. Like, itself was not a necessity, right? Which of course then would be fitting, because that possibility had to be entailed in the meta structure that Hegel has put forth in order to even be afforded. Therefore, it's all contained. There is no meta law. There's only a meta law likeness. So that's how you do it. But then, in a certain regard, modern philosophy after Hegel, I think Hegel would say, is basically a certain looking for the language, looking for the situation, looking for the relating to the past, memory, as Jochen would stress, by which to realize that latent dimensionality. That then, here's the funny part. I would argue you only are going to understand Hegel if you do Plato, Aristotle, and all the classic people. So then you need the entire gambit to see the middle. And this is why time is all time at the same time, that there's actually a gestalt to it. Like, there has to be a gathering of the whole to see the point that unveils there's a whole together. And that then, why would you do that unless you realize the point of which unveils there's a whole together? The strike of beauty. Something at you that sends you on a journey. Because there has to be at any point of the gestalt, the whole, the information of the whole that could possibly be unfolded like a hologram. Like, a hologram means every point contains all the information. So in every possible phenomenon has to be the possibility of realizing the entire structure of history in terms of this metaphysics that I'm so describing. And so then, if you could actually, that's why people are like emphasizing presence and all. I'm going to stop. Like, actually being present can actually unveil the whole that you need the point to see, because the point is holographic. Now that's too much, but so yes, I'm going to give it to Mr. Luber. Mr. Luber.
Amazing. I'm right. I'm right with you. It is a little paralyzing when you have to explain the ins and outs. Okay. Okay. So, like, with Ebert's work, I really, really like his work, in the sense of, like, one of the many aspects, like the problematicity, automaticity aspect, especially as it's relating to everything that you're talking about, like that account that you're talking about here, of this metaphysical account, because the tension in terms of being able to choose a commedia is basically what's at stake. Consciousness is when there's a problem. So like Ebert inverts the notion of how people normally talk about consciousness, pattern recognition. That's why he's so focused on surprise, and like basically when you're wrong is when you're conscious, essentially. So in that respect, like, even if like him like posing the question of like, I think I have some basically ideas and formulations that might help in terms of machine consciousness, but I don't know if that's a good idea or not. I don't. One tension here is how do we know that by not taking action, it's choosing a comedia? That's a very interesting problem, because the problem, and it will always be an ongoing one, in the sense of, you, like you said, that you have to take in the whole, and in an ironic sense, being present in relation is the account of the moment, but we have to have when we're picking comedia, we have to pick it from a conscious place, which means we have to pick it when there's a problem. So a problem happens, and our response to that problem, to me, like, I don't know if that's considered the first moment of automaticity and we're out of problematicity, like the response, like that, like these are certain tension points and questions that I have, because the intentional nature of things, because we have to intentionally pick a comedia. Like, that's what's at stake. Not accidentally picking one, but if we can intentionally do that. So the whole idea of theme is that you can kind of delineate, like using like bounce and distance and those certain aspects, you can delimit basically, knowing that it's the time is now to make the choice. So like your whole like class with Parallax and about like the AI causer, it's interesting where it's like, yeah, we actually can articulate using basically a story ontology what the stakes are and what the choice is right now, and it's actually happening right now, and that the fact that it's happening right now is partly due to the reason why such an ontology has become transparent. So it's like that move that you're talking about with Hegel, where it's like you realize the limit, and then at the same time it's like not the limit because it's not the boundary. So because when you realize the limit's dead. That's why it's more than just the limit, and that's why the boundary is always moving. That's why it's a moving target in that respect. So it's just the question is, it's like we're gonna need to systematize it basically. Otherwise, if you can't systematize it, right? How do we actually respond to it in our day and age? Like, if if the response is it's system-like, right, where it's like it's not a law, it's law-like, it's like, oh, so in that sense, it's like being thematic, right? Something like that. But like hearing that and being able to understand that and being able to articulate it if you don't understand it and why it matters is like, you in a certain sense it's isomorphic, because the receiver that doesn't understand it has to go through some sort of journey then that you can't systematize at all. So I know like your work is putting people in a higher likelihood of going through their own journey, and that's all you can do is just habituate spaces to put people in a higher likely, like in a more likely position for that to happen, right? Is that good enough? I guess, right? Like that's part of the because if it's more than likelihood, then it's beginning the argument would be it's becoming more to law, not law-like. But then and this is really my last point here, my last not point, just like recapping. But this is more of a point, I guess, actually. what does it signify or mean when that understanding becomes a worldview, like a colloquial notion of a worldview, where it's like we actually do the masses do, you know, we do this law-like thing on purpose because we know that it needs to be law-like, right? Just like you follow the Torah or whatever because that's like what you do because that's what you do. It's similar energy as that, but the difference is like it's law-like, so it's dynamic. It's not. It might not be. It like basically there's a tension in terms of like how to treat the religions that don't necessarily explicitly frame themselves as a law-like necessity, right? Because it's like they at the time haven't encountered enough history to do that. But if you go back to your point, retroactively, they actually were doing that, but they just didn't know because they haven't experienced it yet, right? So forget it. Just it fucking takes forever to get to the actual, like, it's crazy. So forgive me. Like, so basically, how when we are in a position where we have to after we habituate people to look at things as law-like, right? How do you choose that law-like thing? Because here, the thing about the point about the future retroactive move is we need to choose now how to do that in order for people to even be habituated to the law-like thing. So like circumventing or circulating basically the space that's required, we need to be actually articulated in some modular like way where you as the subject can bring your own experience into it to fill in the logical definitions that are already that are there. So like with theme, I have like there's bounce and distance, there's inference beat, connotation beat, denotation beat. But like the rule isn't telling you that the content has to be this content. The rule is just telling you stipulations for what the content needs to be. You have to bring that yourself, and there's going to be multiple options. So you have to be able to discern, you know, which option matches up to the parameters the best. And that's totally up to your subjective position. But that's in a story. So like if that's not able to be mapped onto reality, to Greg's point earlier, because people aren't interested in it, then we got a problem. We got a serious problem. We're done. We're cooked. Like we're cooked. And like the problem I'm saying is the reason why people aren't interested, because we are cooked right now, is because there hasn't been a full articulation of how to choose the law-like thing. Because we need to be able to choose the law-like thing, then people will care. And I don't think, including myself, like it has not been fully scaffolded. It has not been revealed in a significant enough way for it to be transparent. And I understand we have beauty, and I understand we have theme, and I understand we have lack, and we can and belonging, and all these things, you know. But it's like, do we have to read? I guess in a certain sense we do, where it's like your big books. Like I'm still going through it, and I'm like years of listening to you, still grappling with it. You know what I mean? Where it's like, do we have to do that? Because not everyone's going to do that. No one's doing that. No one's going to do that. But do we have to in order to be able to choose the law-like thing? Does everybody need to? Or do some people need to? And then it needs to be reconfigured in a way where it can become more virus-like. But it's like, you could argue, well, Hegel or Kant, read that. That was fucking tough. Like, that, and that became virus-like. So I don't know. That I'm gonna stop there, but
No, absolutely. Everything in Belonging Again must be able to apply without anyone reading any of it. And the only way you're going to bring about the quote unquote change that you're describing via spread versus scale is by having the simplest of all possible principles or lowest level transaction cost, of which, if done, will create the conditions of possibility for a critical mass of people of whom would do the things talked about in Belonging Again without actually having to read it. Because if it has to be read, Belonging Again needs to be there to justify those who would say this won't do what you're claiming, but it doesn't have to be read in order to do what is being claimed. That would be the difference. So there has to simply be a function of Belonging Again has to be basically to sustain criticism. But but anyone whose strategy is the reading of a book, that by definition will have limits to spread. But if instead the book is pointing to something, that can be done without reading the book. But then if someone says, I don't want to keep doing this, the book would be there to give you reason for the faithful presence of continuing to do it. That would have to be. So of course, the ultimate claim would be basically what needs to be done is making it tenable, plausible to a critical mass of people that participation in the social coordination mechanism is in fact that which could bring about socioeconomic and political change, and Belonging Again would be justification of that, because it creates the conditions of possibility by which to actually extend convivially the human being to handle the conditions of global pluralism and not be overwhelmed by the unleashed collective subconscious that is driving everybody crazy. And that actually there is right now basically a forcing function that is making everyone more likely to consider as plausible the need for a new social coordination mechanism, which is global interconnectivity via technology and pluralism, that's making everyone feel crazy. And that feeling of being crazy then makes actually people looking for sense making or like infrastructures of coordination to actually help them, well, be human, or else you're just going to look for an AI that's going to do your thinking for you, as opposed to using AI to help you be human, because it is not necessarily the case that AI is bad. In fact, as Mr. Satori has shown, it can be used to help with social coordination. So basically, Belonging Again would like to make the case that if you were to convince a critical mass of people to participate in the social coordination mechanism, that this would financially and economically be beneficial, would be good for the GDP, that it would actually help with democracy, it would actually train people as subjects to handle psychoanalytical concerns. It's actually, there's reason to think it would work from history, looking at Nordic and the Denmark nations and comparison, like history is what's actually possible. It is making a case that it is plausible to think that actually doing these conversations is truly a significant grassroots movement, which on the face of it, you're going to say, that's ridiculous. Of course you are. It's ridiculous to think that people doing like TLC or philosophy portal, it's ridiculous to think that that actually could be a significant grassroots movement that would actually create the conditions by which the average person would be in the state to realize, to choose, lack is not nothing, in the way that you are so describing. It seems ridiculous. Well, Belonging Again exists to argue that no, there's actually really good reason to think that it would work. So you don't have to read Belonging Again to do it, because just doing it and making yourself open to doing it will turn you into the kind of subject that is more plausible to do what you're saying, Mr. Luber, than not. But if you say, that's ridiculous, well, then the books are there to show, no, actually, there's good reason to think from history that it would actually do that. And actually, if we look at economic modeling, turns out that the mode and subjectivity of people in an economic system determines if there's non-zero sum growth versus zero sum growth. And it also turns out that the experience, the only way to actually sublimate desire into drive, which is due to the fundamental incompleteness of the subject, is in relationality that throughout history has lacked sufficient coordination in order to address properly. But now we have sufficient coordination or mechanisms of such by which to do that. And if you just do it, you're going to do all that. Like, you can't have the address of the world be a book that people need to read, memorize, and put into action, right? Like that it can work. Like the way that like religions did that by saying this book is from freaking God. Like, and you can get a lot of people to read a book if you say it's from God, but then there are other religious books. So the use of the book at this created global pluralism, but it cannot address global pluralism. Right? And I'm not saying books are bad, but if you're looking for an address of global pluralism, you need to look for a mechanism of the coordination of the books, not just another book that everyone needs to read. Because if that's what you're doing, there's a contingency, right? And there's a high transaction cost, right? And most people have not even perfectly memorized their holy book. So why would they perfectly memorize a random philosophy book, right? So instead,
there has to be a defense of the model. And basically, in a very real way, all Belonging Again wants to do is make it plausible to people that engaging in these kind of conversations and the social coordination mechanism is worth doing. Because there's constantly the feeling that it's a waste of time and that you shouldn't prioritize it. And what if we're just making content because we're ego-driven? And what do ideas matter anyway? It is really hard to believe and to continue doing something that you yourself may have even felt and benefited from the impacts of doing. It is very easy to lose faith in things that you know were beautiful at the time. And a book can be useful to actually remind yourself of something, or for any economist who would say it's ridiculous to think that the way that subjects use language determines if a system is going to be non-zero-sum growth or zero-sum growth. That seems ridiculous. And I would agree that it would seem ridiculous, but history shows us that this is the case. And that in fact, if we don't learn how to use language in different ways, we're going to be structured by discourse into a Kafka novel, as the Frankfurt School understood. That is all the case. But you don't need to read Belonging Again to get that. You just need to put yourself into the space of coordination of the social coordination mechanism, which then the argument would be you so doing increase the probability of strikes of beauty and forming yourself according to virtue, et cetera, so forth, even if you don't even realize it, right? And basically to make yourself the kind of person of whom is going to choose the comedia versus not. And I think that's part of the work. And what we can do then, because you're also describing like, you know, people have to be articulating it now in order for there to be future people who could grasp on. Well, it's in a certain sense, our job is to model, like not necessarily to the articulation has to simply serve and maintain to help with having faith in the modeling. But what we have to do is model. That's one of the reasons why I put the video. Why not just make this a private conversation? Why put the videos up? Because we're modeling. Because if you don't actually like put it up, it can't be a model that has grassroots possibility. And if you stop doing it, it can't have grassroots possibility. Like a lot of what the internet needs to be used for, that content making services, but is not reducible to, is in fact the showing of models of this way of life that then hopefully the aim is that Belonging Again makes a case for is of significant socioeconomic and political possibility that we are totally desperate for in our current world that is on the verge of many a catastrophe because it is lacking a social coordination mechanism in a world that needs it. Or so Belonging Again will argue. But with that, I will run and look for a tomato sandwich. Thank you all for your time. It's always a pleasure to be here. Thank you all.